Greetings, traveller of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors, where the Astronomican's light gutters like a Prometheum lamp running dry, where the Geller field is a prayer whispered against a hurricane, and where hope is a currency so devalued that most souls stopped carrying it long before they understood what they'd spent it on. Before we descend, secure the Geller field. Strike that icon and hold back the warp. Join the crew. Subscribe. Let the bell of notification ring across the void, like the death toll of a world that no longer appears on Imperial Cartographica. Today's transmission carries Vermilion clearance. It is the testimony of a woman the Administratum does not acknowledge employed, recovered from a site the Administratum does not acknowledge exists, concerning an event the Administratum does not acknowledge occurred. Every word of it is true. Every word of it has been classified. You are reading it anyway. This is the record of Volundris IV. This is the record of the Order of the Fractured Chalice. This is what the Emperor's silence sounds like when it stretches long enough to have a shape. Listen carefully. It begins in the dark, as all true things do. I am not a soldier. I want to begin with that, because everything that follows will seem like the record of someone who was, someone who carried weapons, who understood the geometry of violence, who moved through burning corridors and collapsing war zone architecture with some kind of trained certainty. I did those things, but I did not do them as a soldier. I did them as an Archivist Secundus of the Munitorum's Battlefield Documentation Corps, which is the Imperium's way of saying, I did them as a woman with a stylus and a deep, possibly clinical compulsion to write everything down. This compulsion has been called, at various points in my career, professionalism, pathology, and, by the Inquisitor who eventually reviewed my case, the only reason you are still breathing, Voss. So kindly do not examine it too closely. I have been told not to examine it. I examine everything. This is also my function. My name is Maren Voss. I was, 31 standard years old when this assignment was processed through the Munitorum's tertiary deployment office aboard the command barge Sovereign of Ruin, Segmentum Obscurus, Volundris system, third month of the cult uprising on Volundris IV. I have dark hair that I keep pinned because loose hair catches on equipment clasps and becomes a problem. I have hands that are permanently ink-stained in a pattern that a medici once told me resembled bruising before he understood what he was looking at. I have a stylus on my belt, a data slate with a cracked screen that I've repaired 11 times with different solutions, a parchment logbook rated for environmental exposure up to and including moderate acidic precipitation, and a pair of boots one size too large, because the Munitorum's requisition system allocated my gear by height rather than actual foot measurement, and I have never been able to correct the record. I am telling you these details because they are the last ordinary details I remember about myself. What I was before the reliquary of the blind eye is Maren Voss who worried about boot sizing. What I was after is harder to categorize. The assignment came at 0300 hours. I know this because I was awake, which was not unusual. The Sovereign of Ruin is a command barge designed to operate continuously, and the light levels throughout its interior remain at approximately 60% illumination at all hours. A compromise that satisfies no one and produces a population of crew members who are never entirely certain whether they have slept or simply blinked. The vox on my bunk side panel chimed, a servitor's voice, monotone and wet-throated in the way of a unit whose vocal mechanisms haven't been maintained in several decades. Archivist Secundus Voss. Report to Briefing Chamber 9. Authorization code Sigma Clave. Attendance is mandatory. Sigma Clave was a clearance designation I had seen exactly once before, on a document I was assigned to copy and immediately seal. It meant the briefing was above the standard chain of documentation. It meant what I was told inside that room would not appear on any record I was authorized to file. It meant someone, somewhere in the upper architecture of the Imperium's command structure, had decided that a thing was happening, and that thing needed to happen without the institutional memory of its happening. I put on my boots, the 2 large ones, my only ones, and I went. Briefing Chamber 9 was smaller than its number suggested. The Sovereign of Ruin had 17 briefing chambers, and they were numbered in an order that had once made topographical sense before 3 separate renovation projects had rearranged the ship's interior without updating the numbering system. Chamber 9 was, in fact, located between chambers 14 and 2, down a corridor that smelled of recycled coolant and old prayer parchment. The smell of the Sovereign of Ruin overall was the smell of 10,000 people living in close quarters inside a machine that had been recycling their air and their water and their organic waste for longer than anyone could reliably calculate. A smell that is not unpleasant exactly, but is so thoroughly saturated with humanness that it begins to function as a reminder. You are made of meat, and meat is what keeps this vessel running. And the vessel does not particularly care about the individual piece of meat, only the aggregate function. I had developed, over 4 years of service, a complicated relationship with this smell. It was, by the time of this assignment, almost comforting. It was the smell of the ordinary. It was not the smell of what waited for me on Volundris 4. 4 others were in Chamber 9 when I arrived, and they became, by default and by munitorum logistics, my companions in what followed. I will describe them as I first saw them, because first impressions in extreme situations carry a weight that later familiarity can obscure, and I want the record to preserve that weight. The man at the head of the table I identified as Sergeant Primus Davin Crail before he introduced himself, because the rank insignia on his Tempestus Scion's greatcoat were worn in the particular way of someone who has held the rank long enough that the insignia have become structurally integrated into the garment. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested not enhancement, but decades of the specific physical labor of carrying armor, carrying weapons, carrying the dead. His neck bore a tattoo of the Imperial Aquila, not the decorative kind, not the devotional kind, but the service kind. Permanent ink in the standard issue pattern applied by munitorum medical staff to identify personnel whose remains might otherwise be unrecognizable. He had prayer beads in his left hand, and he was working them in a pattern, not nervously, not devotionally, mechanically. The way a man operates a tool so familiar he no longer thinks about it. He looked at me when I entered, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been told a specific type of package is being attached to his mission and is choosing to process that information without comment. To his left, Specialist Orun Tal. I placed him at 22, perhaps 23 standard years. His carapace plate was new enough that the surface still had a slight manufacturing sheen, and he had been trying to sand it down. The signs were visible on the pauldrons, deliberate abrasion to age the armor, to look like a man who had been somewhere. He was checking the seal on his rebreather mask for the 3rd time since I'd sat down. I know this because I had started counting without deciding to. He hadn't noticed his own hands were doing it. To Crail's right, Specialist Sirene Hull. She was the first one who looked directly back when I looked at her, which told me something. She had a shaved head and a scar that bisected her left eyebrow in a clean diagonal, the kind of scar that results from a clean instrument rather than combat. Possibly a surgical intervention, possibly an accident, almost certainly painful either way. She was reading from a devotional pamphlet. Standard issue, the the kind distributed to guard and science forces on deployment. 43 pages of approved liturgical text, printed on paper thin enough to use as field dressing in an emergency. Her eyes were on the third page. Her eyes had not moved from the third page in the time I'd been watching. She had not turned it. She was holding it open and not reading it, and I thought, this is what keeping yourself together looks like for her. The pamphlet is an anchor, not a text. And finally, Enginseer Tertius Prax Solmund, Adeptus Mechanicus, detached to this mission for technical retrieval support. He sat apart from the rest of us in the way that Mechanicus personnel habitually sit apart. Not antisocially, but in the manner of someone who has reorganized their relationship to human proximity as one factor among many to be managed rather than a condition to be enjoyed. His red robes were cleaner than the environment of a command barge warrant, which suggested either recent laundering or a personal maintenance protocol applied with religious consistency. He had 2 mechadendrites, articulated at 6 points each, currently folded against his back in the posture of rest. One of them twitched, twice, in the several minutes before the briefing began. Small movements, uncoordinated with anything visible, the movements of a limb dreaming. I took the seat farthest from the door, which is where I always sit. Closest to the exit is for people who might need to run. Farthest from the exit is for people who intend to stay until they have written it all down. The colonel entered at 0317. I never learned his name. He wore a rebreather mask, not for environmental reasons. The chamber's air was filtered and rated clean. He wore it as a precaution, or as a statement, or as both. He was of medium height and medium build, and the rest of him was obscured by the generic grey of a senior munitorum coat. He carried nothing. He stood at the head of the table and he spoke, and his voice through the mask had the distorted quality of something transmitted rather than produced. Flat, with soft edges ground off. The mission, the Order of the Fractured Chalice, a minor but decorated Adepta Sororitas order, had held the reliquary of the Blind Eye Fortress-Monastery in the southern spire of Hive Velundris for 3 months of the cult uprising. They had been the last loyalist formation anchoring the spire's southern approach. 14 days ago, their Vox contact ceased. Not static. The colonel was careful about this distinction. Not signal degradation, not interference, not technical failure. Silence. A clean cessation, as though someone had turned off a switch. The reliquary's encrypted battle cogitator held 3 months of combat intelligence, cult movement patterns, leadership identification data, ritual site coordinates, and, the colonel paused here briefly, the personal liturgical transcripts of Canoness Vesper Auric, who the Inquisition had reason to believe may have identified something about the nature of the cult's warp working in her final days of contact. We were to enter the reliquary, retrieve the cogitator, and extract. 48 hours. After 48 hours, orbital fire was scheduled to sterilize the site. 3 things he said that I cannot stop hearing. The first, do not interact with any sisters you find inside the reliquary. If any are alive, do not engage them in conversation. Administer the Emperor's peace and retrieve the cogitator. The second, the perimeter shows no evidence of external assault. Whatever happened at the reliquary happened from within. The third, and this is the one that has kept me awake in the facility they put me in afterward, has kept me awake now for 6 months, turns over in my mind with the patient persistence of a mill wheel in a river that does not stop. You have 48 hours before this site is subjected to orbital bombardment. We cannot risk what is inside that building reaching the surface population. I asked what was inside the building. He looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I became aware of Krail's prayer beads stopping. Doubt, he said. Then he left, and we were given 2 hours to prepare, and I sat in the empty briefing chamber for several minutes after the others had gone, and I wrote every word of it down on parchment, because I had already learned that whatever this was, no data slate record would survive it intact. The Arvus lighter assigned to our insertion was a craft that the Munitorum's pool designation listed as tertiary atmospheric transport, hull designation 77 Gamma Auric, but which someone in the crew had taken to calling, in hand-scratched lettering above the cargo ramp controls, the enduring complaint. I found this accurate. The craft complained in a sustained and comprehensive manner from the moment its plasma drives cycled up to the moment they were shut down. A complaint expressed through the language of mechanical distress, hull groans that moved through the fuselage like the slow passage of a hand pressed against metal from the inside, drive vibrations that set the deck plates rattling at frequencies just below the threshold of pain, and a persistent harmonic whistle from the starboard heat vane assembly that Solmond had diagnosed as non-critical in the pre-flight check, and that I spent 47 minutes trying not to hear as a voice. Inside the cargo belly, the smell was the compressed summary of every person and every object that had ever occupied that space. Promethium, pressed reclamation paste, what the guard called corpse starch, and what tasted, in the mouth, like the nutritional content of food filtered through the memory of something that had once been food, machine oil, boot leather, recycled oxygen that had been through enough lungs to have acquired a faint organic sweetness, the kind of sweetness you stop noticing only when you have nothing else to breathe. I sat with my back against the fuselage, and my data slate on my lap, and my parchment logbook open on top of the slate, because the slate had been running a stylus input calibration error since the previous week, and I had learned to maintain parallel documentation as a matter of course. The bench opposite held Krael and Siren and Orun in a row. Solmond occupied the fold-down seat at the far end. The cargo bay had no viewport, which was standard for atmospheric insertion craft. The designers had decided correctly that personnel in transit rarely benefited from visual confirmation of how high they were. I worked. This is not heroism. It is not professionalism, or not only. It is the thing that my hands do when my mind is trying not to acknowledge the size of its own fear, and that relationship between the movement of the stylus and the management of terror is one I had developed over 4 years of being sent to places where things had recently gone catastrophically wrong, and then asked to document the catastrophe from the inside. The Munitorum's battlefield documentation core is not a combat assignment. It is not a cushy one either. We go where events have happened and we write down what happened, and sometimes events are still happening while we do this, and the Munitorum's position on this logistical problem is that the documentation of ongoing events is inherently more accurate than retrospective reconstruction, and so we are sent in and we write it down, and what we feel about this is a private matter that the Munitorum is not resourced to address. I wrote down everything from the briefing. Then I wrote down the physical details of the lighter. Then I stopped writing and looked at my companions, because this too is my function. Observation. Krael had not moved since we boarded. His prayer beads were working again. The left hand, constant, that patient mechanical cycling. But the rest of him was still in the absolute stillness of a man who has trained himself to conserve the energy of consciousness for when it is required. His eyes were open and not looking at anything in the cargo bay. Whatever he was looking at was internal, historical, or aspirational. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who has been afraid so many times that the feeling has become simply another operational parameter to be managed. Orun had checked the seal on his rebreather mask 7 times. I had counted. Each check was identical in duration and technique. The same rotation of the collar seal, the same pressure test finger applied at the same 2 points, which told me it was a genuine training habit. not anxiety performance. He was genuinely concerned about the air. The briefing had mentioned warp saturation without elaborating on its physical effects, and Arun had either read enough to know what sustained warp exposure does to human biology, or had been told by someone older and was now running the information through his body, which is where information tends to go when it frightens you. Siren had not turned the page of the devotional pamphlet. I confirmed this by the crease pattern. The same fold stressed, the same edge worn. Third page. She had decided, for reasons I did not yet know, that the third page was sufficient. Or she had decided the third page was as far as she trusted herself to go. And I thought of bulkheads, the watertight doors they seal on a sinking ship, trying to contain the damage to one section so the rest might float. And Solmund was talking to his equipment, not loudly, not in any language I could pass from across the bay. His lips moved in the way of someone speaking technical notation, aloud as a mnemonic, and two of his mechadendrite tips were touching his hard case retrieval unit in the way of fingers counting rosary, not his prayer, not his tradition, but something that served the same function in the architecture of his cognition. The physical confirmation that the thing he depended on was still present and still whole. The lighter dropped suddenly, 30 meters in 2 seconds, caught by a thermal. We all lurched. Orun grabbed the bench rail. Siren's pamphlet fell. She picked it up and found the third page again with the speed of a woman who has done this before in exactly this way, which meant she had already dropped it in the past, which meant the turbulence was not the first time she had needed to find her page again. We were 30 minutes from insertion. Through the hull, very faint, felt more than heard, a subsonic pressure against the chest cavity, the distant concussion of artillery. Volundris 4 was shelling itself or being shelled. From inside the lighter at altitude, the distinction was not perceptible. It was simply the language the planet was speaking, the repeated declarative statement of a world in the process of consuming itself. And I had read in the mission briefing that this had been ongoing for 93 days. And I thought of all the other archivists who had been sent in to document those 93 days. And I thought of all the parchment they had filled. And I thought of the Administratum seal that would eventually be placed on all of it. And I thought, someone at a desk in the segmentum command structure is going to read a summary of what has happened on this world. And they are going to make a notation. And the notation is going to say something in the language of scale, acceptable losses, strategic repositioning, asset write-off, and the 48-hour orbital bombardment window is going to be a line in a ledger somewhere, and the ledger is going to be filed, and the file is going to be sealed, and this world is going to cease to exist in the institutional memory of the Imperium, the way a sound ceases to exist in a room once you close the door. I wrote, I am afraid. This is a new kind of fear. Previous assignments were afraid of the things I could see. This fear is about the things I cannot see yet. And the things I cannot see yet are what worries me about what I will see when I can. Then the lighter began its descent through the cloud layer, and I looked up from the parchment for the first time in 20 minutes because Solmund had made a sound. Not words, just a sound. The particular inhalation of a man whose instruments have reported something that requires the integration of additional sensory data to process correctly. The cloud layer, he said, to no one specifically, in the tone of a man annotating a finding. The particulate composition is inconsistent with standard chemical warfare byproduct or industrial emissions. A pause. His mechadendrites moved in what I had already begun to read as a gesture of uncertainty, a slight outward spreading of the tips. It contains psychoactive compounds, extremely low concentration, below threshold for acute neurological effect. But chronic exposure. He stopped, looked at the retrieval unit in his lap. The cloud layer over the southern spire has been continuous for 14 days. Nobody spoke. The light had dropped through the infected yellow-green cloud, and through the hull I imagined I could smell it, though I could not. The seals were rated, the air was recycled, and I thought about the Sisters of the Fractured Chalice breathing this air for 14 days, this air that was not quite right in ways so subtle that your instruments had to tell you, your own biology simply absorbing it and adapting. And I wrote nothing because there are moments when the thing that needs to be documented is the moment itself, and writing breaks it open and spills it before you've understood its shape. The lighter leveled, slowed. The ramp light clicked from red to amber. Crail stood. His prayer beads disappeared somewhere in his coat. He checked his hellgun in the automatic way of a man who checks his hellgun the way another man checks his face in a mirror. Confirmation of identity rather than function. He said, in the voice of a man who has given the same speech many times and has reduced it to its essential components. We go in, we get the cogitator, we leave. We do not linger. We do not investigate beyond the primary objective. If you see something that concerns you, you tell me, and I decide what to do about it. Questions? Orun checked his rebreather seal. This time he did it differently. Shorter, harder. Not habit. Fear. Sireni folded the devotional pamphlet and put it in her inside breast pocket, over the heart, where armor doesn't quite close, where a person keeps a thing they want to keep. Solomon said, "No questions." I said nothing. I closed my logbook. The ramp dropped. Volundris IV hit us like a fact. The cold was the first thing. Not weather cold, not the standard cold of a compromised atmospheric processor, but the cold of a place where the temperature has been governed by something other than physics for long enough that physics has ceded the authority. It came in through the collar of my coat and went directly for the spaces between my ribs, and I thought of a word, absence, and could not immediately locate what the word was the absence of. Later I would understand. Warmth, not temperature warmth. The warmth that a place has when the living beings inside it are generating it. The warmth of a crowd, of an inhabited space, of a world where the things alive are oriented toward continuation. Volundris IV's southern spire outskirts were oriented toward nothing. The hab blocks that had once housed 3 million people in the compressed strata of hive architecture had been reduced, by 93 days of war, to a series of geometric shapes. Truncated columns of ferrocrete, slabs of facade still bearing the ghost impressions of windows, load-bearing walls standing in isolation, like the single remaining teeth of a destroyed mouth. The ground between them was churned. Artillery, boots, tracked vehicles, rain, and had achieved a consistency somewhere between mud and the medium that mud becomes when it has absorbed everything that has been placed in it and is no longer simply soil but the record of what the soil has been made to hold. It moved wrong. I noticed this first because I stepped in it and expected one thing and received another. The mud of a recent battlefield has a texture. It resists, it grabs, it releases in a specific sequence. This mud was slower, not dramatically slower, a fraction, as though it had acquired some additional weight, or as though the impulse to yield was taking longer than it should to travel through its substance. Solomon crouched beside a pool of it, 2 mechadendrite tips extending toward the surface. He withdrew them faster than I had seen him withdraw anything, and he said nothing, and I wrote, "The mud behaves incorrectly, and Solomon will not touch it." The sky was the yellow-green of an infected wound. Through it, the Volundris primary star was present but diminished, a pale smear of light that offered illumination without warmth, like a lamp in a sealed room. It was mid-morning by the chronometer, and the light said nothing about the time. The light was not offering information. The light was simply occurring without commitment. The reliquary of the blind eye was visible from the LZ. I had read about its architecture in the mission briefing, but architecture described in administrative language is always an abstraction. The physical fact of it, 2 kilometers distant, rising from the devastated landscape of the spire's outskirts. The physical fact was different. The Order of the Fractured Chalice had built in the classical shape of their patron symbol, a closed hand, the fingers curled inward, the fist held upright. 5 towers formed the fingers. The central mass of the Sanctuary Majoris formed the palm, and the whole structure rose perhaps 60 meters, which in hive terms was modest, but in the context of the collapsed and smoking terrain around it was enormous, and still and dark in a way that dark things on a dark day are not. Dark in a way that suggested the darkness was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that light did not penetrate. It should have had running beacons, navigation lights for the Munitorum supply runs, servitor drones on standard patrol circuits, heat signatures from the life support of however many sisters had been resident. The auspex on Solman's wrist said otherwise. No beacons, no drones, a heat signature consistent with an inhabited structure, life support still running, atmospheric processes still cycling, but distributed evenly, uniformly, without the clustered variations that living, moving beings produce. As though the building were warm, and whatever was warming it was not moving. 2 kilometers, Krail said. He did not say, let's go. He said the distance, and then he began walking, and we followed, because that is the nature of the man. He does not issue commands where physical precedence suffices. The Vox relay tower was 300 meters into the approach, positioned at the intersection of what had once been a commercial boulevard and what was now a debris field in the shape of a commercial boulevard. It was a standard Imperial Vox installation, a ferrocrete pillar mounted with a 3-axis rotating array, the array currently stationary, the indicator light on the pillar's access panel dark. Solman stopped. He interfaced, mechadendrite tip into the access port, a brief alignment sequence, 11 seconds of connection. Then he disconnected. He said, "The relay is functional. The array has power. There is simply nothing broadcasting through it." A pause. The log shows a cessation of signal 14 days ago, consistent with the reported timeline. Another pause. He was building to something, I could tell. There was a quality to his hesitation that was not computational delay, but the organic reluctance of a being, even a partly augmented one, to say a thing that is true and uncomfortable. The final transmission was logged at 14 days, 3 hours, 17 minutes ago. Duration, 4 hours and 17 minutes. Content type notation in the log identifies it as liturgical audio. Specifically, a single piece of liturgical audio, 48 seconds in length, repeated without interruption for 4 hours and 17 minutes. The piece is identified in the Order's ceremonial registry as the Litany of the Steadfast, 2nd verse. Then the signal ends. Nobody moved. Orun said quietly, to himself or to the Emperor or to the heir, 4 hours. And 17 minutes, Solman confirmed. We stood in the ruins of the commercial boulevard with the infected sky above us, and the slow wrong mud around us, and the silhouette of the reliquary ahead. And nobody said anything else about the Vox relay because there was nothing else to say about it that was not already in all of our bodies. The knowledge was there. The knowing had been there since briefing chamber 9, since the colonel said doubt and left. The relay tower was simply the first time the knowing had found a fact large enough to anchor itself to. We walked. The outer gate of the reliquary of the blind eye was, per the mission documentation, 3 meters of armorplate composite reinforced with adamantine banding, capable of withstanding direct heavy artillery fire. rated against plasma bolt penetration at ranges below 50 meters, and described in the Order's own architectural record as the last assurance of the faithful, that what is inside may endure even what is outside cannot. It was open, not broken, not forced, not damaged. Open at approximately a 45-degree angle, as though the last person through it had simply not closed it, as though the idea of closing it had not occurred to them, as though they had been thinking of something else, or not thinking at all. Crail looked at it for a long moment. His prayer beads were not in his hand. I noticed this and could not decide whether it was significant. He walked through the gate. I followed. We all followed. This is the nature of gates that stand open. They are very persuasive. The courtyard of the reliquary opened around us, wide, walled, the towers rising at the cardinal and sub-cardinal points, the main processional entrance ahead, dark behind its own arch. The courtyard's lumen strips along the parapet walls were dark, but there were bolter emplacements at regular intervals, loaded, locked, aimed at the empty entrance, aimed at us, unmanned. The fuel lines for the Prometheum defense channels that ran along the base of the outer wall were full. Everything was exactly where everything should be, in the configuration of a position that is prepared to defend itself, manned by people who have stepped away for a moment. The tables were what stopped me. Against the eastern wall, sheltered by a corrugated metal lean-to that the sisters had constructed for outdoor meal times, standard practice for communities where the interior spaces are reserved for function over comfort, stood 3 long tables, 30 chairs, 30 place settings, tin cups, bowls of what had been, 14 days ago, the standard order midday meal, a pressed grain mixture, supplemented with reclaimed protein, the kind of meal that is nutritional rather than pleasant. The bowls had congealed, the cups were empty or had evaporated, the arrangement was untouched. Not a chair pushed back, not a bowl moved, not a crumb disturbed by scavengers, which was itself wrong, because there were always scavengers. They had sat down for a meal, or had prepared to sit down for a meal, and then something had interrupted that, had interrupted it between the preparation and the sitting, or between the sitting and the beginning, and whatever had interrupted it had been sufficient that no one had returned. The meal remained. Nobody had cleaned it. Nobody had returned to clean it. I turned to write this in my log, and when I turned back, I saw, at the edge of my peripheral vision, in the distant middle ground of the approach we had just walked, approximately where the small imperial shrine stood with its draped black cloth, a figure, white, still, watching. I looked directly at it. A sister by the silhouette, or a sister's silhouette, or something in the shape of a sister, standing in the rubble of a dead boulevard, unmoving, at a range of perhaps 200 meters. I watched for 3 full seconds. I counted. The figure did not move. The infected cloud shifted. The pale, directionless light altered by some marginal degree. The figure was gone, or the figure had never been there, and the light had been performing the long, patient work of suggestion on a mind that had been told to expect something and had therefore supplied it. I wrote both possibilities in my log. I wrote, the figure, if it was a figure, was watching us enter the gate. The figure, if it was a figure, was wearing white. I wrote, I cannot determine whether I saw a thing or imagined a thing. I am writing down both because this is the function of a witness, to record the uncertainty, not to resolve it. Crail said, Voss, move. I moved. I kept my log open. Behind us, the gate stood open. Before us, the reliquary waited with the patience of a thing that has been waiting for a very long time and has decided patience is no longer the cost of what it wants, but the shape of it. I thought of the Canoness's words. which I had not yet read, which I would read in the scriptorium in 1 hour, in a journal she had left on a shelf with the precision of a woman who intends it to be found, but which I somehow already felt in the architecture of the place. There is no ratio of prayer to silence that produces intervention. We tested it empirically. The result was consistent. I did not know, entering that courtyard, that I was about to learn what happens when people with absolute faith in a thing discover that faith is not enough and decide to keep going anyway. I was about to learn it was the most terrifying thing in the Imperium, more terrifying than the warp, more terrifying than chaos, more terrifying than doubt itself, because at least doubt is honest about what it is. Traveler of the void, the gate stands open behind you now. You have entered with her. You cannot unenter. If this chronicle has found purchase in the architecture of your mind, secure the Geller field. Mark it with your approval. Let the Emperor witness your presence here. Join the crew. Sound the bell of notification. The next chapter descends into the interior of the reliquary of the Blind Eye, and the interior is waiting to show you what 40 women decided to do with 14 days of silence. Stand by, traveler. The darkness ahead is patient. So are we. Chapter 2. The House of Silent Women. There is a specific quality to entering a building that has been sealed against the outside world for a long time, and the quality is not what you expect. You expect the smell to be the revelation, the stale, compressed accumulation of air that has been breathed and recycled and breathed again until it carries the biological signature of everyone who has lived inside, a kind of olfactory census. And the smell is there, yes. In the reliquary's main processional corridor, it arrived first as cold copper, then as something older and drier, the smell of stone that has been warm for so long it has given up on warmth and settled into a temperature of its own, distinct from and indifferent to the temperature of whatever surrounds it. Then, beneath that, incense, not burning, not recent, the ghost of incense, the residue that accumulates in the pores of stone after years of devotional use, that outlasts the ceremonies that produced it and the people who conducted them, that continues to perfume a space long after there is no one left to burn it. But the smell is not the revelation. The revelation is the sound. What the reliquary of the Blind Eye sounded like upon entering was nothing, which is to say, it sounded the way that silence sounds, when the silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a thing that has consumed it. There is a difference, and the difference is physical. Ordinary silence, the silence of an empty room, of a dormant machine, of a corridor between shifts, has a texture of potentiality. It is silence that could be broken. It vibrates at the frequency of its own contingency, which is the frequency of everything that has ever been said in that space, waiting to be said again. This silence did not vibrate. This silence was settled, complete, the silence of a thing that has been decided. I wrote this in my log at the entrance to the processional corridor, standing in the arch of the main door with Krael ahead of me and Solman behind, and Siren and Orun bracketing us. And I wrote it because I could feel the difference, and I could not yet name what the difference indicated. And naming things is what I do with differences I cannot otherwise resolve. I wrote, the silence here is the silence of resolution, not vacancy. Then I walked forward, because standing still in a doorway is not documentation. It is hesitation, and hesitation, in a building with 47 hours remaining before orbital bombardment, is a form of decision-making I could not afford. The processional corridor was long, designed to produce, in the approach to the main Sanctuary Majoris, a sensation of sustained passage, of transition between the ordinary exterior world and the sanctified interior. The Order's architects had understood that the journey to the sacred ought to feel like a journey, long enough that the walker arrives changed from the person who began it, even if the change is only the change of having walked for 2 minutes rather than 10 seconds. The vaulted ceiling above us rose to 12 meters at its apex, carved with scenes from the Order's founding. The familiar high Gothic iconography of martyrdom and perseverance, figures in white and gold receiving their wounds with expressions of transcendent acceptance. The kind of expressions that only occur in stone because the living human face is not capable of holding both pain and peace at once, without one of them becoming a lie. The lumen strips along the base of the vault were dark. Our suit lumens, 4 beams, Solman's supplementary wrist-mounted unit making a 5th, were the only illumination, and they did what suit lumens always do in large, dark spaces. They created the impression that the darkness was gathered at the edge of the light and retreating just ahead of it, just fast enough to remain invisible. Darkness does not actually behave this way. Darkness is not sentient and does not retreat. But the human visual system, in conditions of high stress and low light, performs a certain involuntary interpretation of the boundary between visible and invisible that produces this impression. And the impression, even when rationally understood, remains bodily persuasive. I was aware of something moving in the space between the pools of light. Not certain enough to report it to Krail, which was my threshold. I had committed internally to not flagging sensory data unless I reached a confidence level sufficient to act on, but aware. The awareness sat in the middle of my sternum, which is where, in my experience, valid awareness tends to sit, distinct from the threat data of the shoulders and the fear data of the gut. The sternum is where the information lives that is real but not yet shaped into language. The mosaics were what interrupted my attention from the ceiling's painted figures, because the mosaics were wrong in a way that took me 3 full steps to understand. They ran along both walls of the processional corridor, floor to head height, thousands of individual tesserae, the painstaking record of decades of devotional artistry. Scenes from the Order's history, the founding Canoness, receiving her sanction from an ecclesiastical delegation, her hands raised, her face composed in that same achieved stone piece of the carved figures above. Battle scenes, white-armored sisters holding positions in the ruins of hive sectors, not entirely unlike the ones surrounding us. The iconography of courage, rendered in a medium that made courage look permanent. Scenes of martyrdom, scenes of miracle, the conventional grammar of a religious order's visual self-understanding, the story a community tells about itself through the medium of its walls. And in the center of the right-hand wall, in the largest single mosaic of the corridor, the central devotional image, the one everything else was designed to lead toward and proceed from, the image that should have been the organizing principle of the entire pictorial program. There was the Emperor on the golden throne. Or rather, there was the Emperor on the golden throne with the light removed. The throne itself was there. The Emperor was there. The attending figures, the supplicants with their upraised arms, the architectural surround of the throne room with its recorded measurements of gold and amber and the deep crimson of the Astronomican's reflected light. All of this was present and intact. The tesserae were untouched. But the light, every beam, every ray, every photon of golden illumination that the mosaic had shown radiating from the throne outward into the surrounding space, had been carefully, individually, deliberately removed. The tesserae pried out. The wall material beneath, grey ferrocrete, exposed in the exact shapes of the beams that had been there, every piece of light, all of it, gone. What remained was the Emperor in darkness, on his throne in a void of his own making. The supplicants reaching upward toward nothing, their hands open, their faces still composed in the expression of people receiving something, receiving nothing. Someone had done this very carefully. It would have taken hours, You would have to want to do it very much to take the time that this required, and you would have to be in a particular state of mind to decide that this was the task that needed doing. In a building under warp siege, with 14 days of silence pressing down on you from all directions, you would have to believe that the image had become false, and you would have to love the image enough to correct it rather than destroy it. Sirene made the sign of the Aquila. I heard the movement before I turned, the rustle of her arm crossing her chest, the quiet firmness of the gesture. She did not speak. The pamphlet in her inner pocket was, I was certain, still folded to the 3rd page. Corrael looked at the mosaic for a long moment. His face in the suit lumen light was the face of a man integrating a datum that does not fit any category his training has prepared for. Not a threat, not an asset, not an obstacle. Simply a fact sitting in the middle of the corridor, demanding to be processed by a mind that has been trained to process things by category. He said, "Keep moving." We kept moving. The scriptorium was through a lateral arch off the main corridor, approximately 40 meters from the entrance, a natural stopping point, given that we needed to establish the cogitator's precise location before attempting to retrieve it. Standard operational logic. Also, I will confess, a relief. The scriptorium was the one space in the reliquary whose function I understood completely. Archives are my architecture. I know how they breathe. This one breathed wrong. The shelving was intact, row upon row of the standard Adepta Sororitas record-keeping system, metal frames holding data coil stacks and illuminated manuscripts in the formal binders of ecclesiastical documentation. The cataloging system was visible in the spine markings, the order's own notation scheme, consistent and legible. The environmental seals on the data coils appeared, to visual inspection, intact. The space was, on a structural level, exactly what a scriptorium should be. The manuscripts were face down on the floor. Not all of them. The operational records, the mission logs, the supply manifests, the personnel files, the tactical correspondence, these remained on their shelves, untouched. Everything that was functional. Everything that performed the work of keeping a military religious order functional, as a military religious order. But the doctrinal codices, the creeds, the founding liturgies, the catechisms, the collected devotional writings of the order's revered dead, every one of them had been pulled from its shelf and placed, face down, on the floor. Not thrown, not dropped. Placed. The placement was deliberate. The spines were parallel, the books arranged in rows, face down, as though the text itself was what needed to be hidden. Not the physical object, but what the object contained. The words turned away. The books prostrate on the floor of their own scriptorium, in the posture of penitence, or of things that could no longer stand. I stood at the entrance to this room for longer than was operationally advisable, because I am an archivist, and a room in which books have been laid face down on the floor is a room in which something has been done to the act of writing itself, to the act of record, to the idea that language can hold a truth still long enough for it to be useful. Someone had decided that the words didn't hold anymore, that the container was empty. They had placed the containers face down on the floor, not in contempt, not in rage, but with the careful, considered precision of people who believe in proper handling, and had moved on. Solmond located a functioning cogitator terminal near the scriptorium's cataloging desk. A secondary unit, linked to the reliquary's main network, still drawing power from the building's operational systems. He interfaced. He cross-referenced the inventory against the mission parameter for the encrypted battle cogitator's designated storage location. The cogitator is housed in the Canoness's private sanctum, he reported. 3rd level, central tower. Standard Sororitas security protocols on the sanctum door. I can extract the override codes from the facility network He paused. There is also a secondary notation in the system log. Another pause. Longer. The cogitator's locator beacon has been manually activated from inside the sanctum within the last 12 hours. Kryl. Someone activated it. Solmond. Or something interacted with the system. The activation was entered via manual interface, not automated trigger. The input record shows a valid authentication code, Canoness level clearance. Nobody spoke for a moment. Orun said what everyone was thinking. She's still in there. Kryl. Or someone with access to her codes. Orun. Or she activated it for us, so we'd know where to go. This possibility, that the Canoness had, within the last 12 hours, deliberately signaled us, anticipated our arrival, prepared something, settled into the room alongside the face-down manuscripts and the missing light from the mosaic and the contaminated cloud that breathed its low-grade wrongness into everything that breathed. And I wrote it down, and the act of writing it down made it more real, which is one of the things writing does that I had always considered a strength and was now discovering could be a liability. We found her in the Medici wing. The Medici bay was a left turn off the corridor, leading from the scriptorium toward the central stairwell. Standard facility positioning, accessible from the main arteries, without requiring injured personnel to navigate complex route finding. Its door was open. Inside, the smell of counterseptic, old and dried out, the ghost of sterility in a room that had been sterile and was now simply empty. Articulated treatment racks, folded, Medici stations with their diagnostic equipment dark, supply cabinets, sealed, their inventory presumably intact. She was in the corner, under the window. The window was a narrow aperture reinforced with wire-set glass, and through it came the infected yellow-green light of the Volundris sky. And in that light, she sat with her back to the wall, and her knees drawn to her chest, and her power armor in a pile beside her. Not damaged, not removed in haste, removed with the patience of someone who has decided armor is no longer what the situation requires. Piece by piece, in the correct sequence, stacked in the correct order. The removal of the armor of a battle sister of the Emperor, conducted properly, from someone who has worn it long enough that the removal is automatic. The muscle memory of decades, even in whatever state she was in when she did it. Beneath it, the white undersuit, standard issue. She was 40 years old, perhaps 45, and her face was the face of someone in whom the structural materials of a person, the bones and muscles and determined surfaces, were entirely intact, and whose interior had been rearranged by something that left no physical mark. She was whispering. The whisper was continuous. I listened, and after a moment I could distinguish it as the litany of the steadfast, the second verse, the one the Vox relay had transmitted for 4 hours and 17 minutes, the same 48 seconds on a loop, delivered in a voice so low and so consistent it had ceased to be devotion and had become something else. The breath keeping a thing alive past the point where the thing wanted to keep going. She did not react when we entered. She did not react when Kryl crossed to her and crouched, his large hands on his knees, his voice careful with the particular carefulness of a large man trying to occupy less space than he physically does. Sister, we are Militarum Tempestus, assigned by Command Authority. We are here on retrieval operations. You are safe. Can you hear me? She stopped whispering. The silence was immediate and total, and it was the silence of something interrupted rather than something concluded. Her eyes moved to Kryl. They were clear, not glassy, not the unfocused eyes of shock, not the fixed eyes of the warp-touched. Clear in the way that eyes are clear when the person behind them has finished fighting with something, has come out the other side of a long conflict, and is now simply on the other side, in the particular stillness that lies beyond exhaustion. she said. We prayed. Her voice was level. Absolutely level. For 14 days we prayed. We held the liturgical hours, prime, tierce, sext, none, vespers, compline, all of them, maintained the full daily office without interruption, while sustaining the perimeter against the cult's warp working. The Canoness told us to pray and the working would lose its purchase. That faith was armor against the warp, and more faith was more armor, and if we prayed with sufficient discipline, the pressure would ease. She paused, not for breath, for accuracy. It didn't ease. Crail. Sister. We prayed more. The Canoness said we prayed more. We did not pray more because we doubted. We prayed more because we believed. That is important. You should write that down. Her eyes moved from Crail to me, to the logbook in my hands. You are the one who writes things down. It was not a question. I said, yes. Then write this. There is no ratio of prayer to silence that produces intervention. We established this empirically. We ran the experiment. 14 days. Full liturgical observation. Sustained communal devotion from 40 trained sisters, with a collective 260 years of dedicated service. The variable was not the quality of the faith. The quality of the faith was constant, and the silence was constant, and the relationship between them did not change, regardless of what we did with the first variable. This is a result. It should be recorded. I wrote it, word for word. Beside me, I was aware of Crail's hand moving toward the sidearm at his hip, and I was aware of the Colonel's words in Briefing Chamber 9. Do not engage them in conversation. Administer the Emperor's peace. And I was aware of the briefing's logic, which was sound logic, which was that a sister of battle who has spent 14 days in warp-saturated conditions, running what she describes as empirical experiments on the efficacy of prayer, is precisely the kind of destabilizing ideation that the Inquisition cannot allow to propagate through the population of a hive world already 3 months into a cult uprising. I was aware of all of this, and I stepped between Crail and the sister anyway. I did not plan to do this. My body did it, and my mind followed, the way the body sometimes acts on information the mind has not yet finished processing. Afterward, I wrote, I do not know exactly why I did this. I know it was not indiscipline. I know it was the sternum awareness responding to something in her face that was not dangerous, something that was simply true. Her name was Iseult Dara. She told us this when I asked. Sister Hospitaller Iseult Dara, assigned to the Order of the Fractured Chalice for 19 years, trained in medici function and battlefield triage, latterly responsible for the spiritual care of the Order's wounded as much as their physical repair. A woman who had spent 19 years in the business of keeping people alive and had discovered, at the end of 14 days of silence, that the mechanism she had been relying on to make that keeping worth doing had stopped responding to her inputs. She would not come with us. She said this calmly, without drama. She would not tell us where the other sisters were. She said, they are where they need to be. I am where I need to be. You will find the cogitator in the Canoness's sanctum. She paused. Whatever you do, I am asking you as a person who has seen what I have seen in that building, do not go to the Sanctuary Majoris. Crail, why not? Iseult looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the whispering from before almost seemed to have resumed, though it had not. Because the Canoness worked very hard on what she built there, she said, and I do not want anyone else to see it before I have decided how I feel about it. And I have not decided yet. And I have been sitting in this room for 3 days, and I have not decided yet. And I think I need more time, and you are not going to give me more time. So I am asking you to at least leave that one thing alone. We left the medici bay. I looked back once. she had resumed the whisper. The litany of the steadfast, second verse, 48 seconds, beginning again. The central stairwell of the reliquary rose from the ground floor in a spiral of worn stone steps. Centuries of use had polished the center of each tread to a shallow concavity, the record of 1,000 feet in devotional procession. The walls of the stairwell carried more mosaic work, smaller scale, intimate, the kind of imagery placed where only the ascending pilgrim would see it, too close and too detailed for a processional viewing. Individual faces, the order's dead specifically, sisters who had fallen in service, rendered in tesserae so fine the faces had an almost photographic quality. Their eyes followed you as you climbed, which was, I had read, intentional. The architects wanted the ascending pilgrim to feel accompanied by those who had already made the full journey. The eyes still followed. We climbed. The building was wrong in a way that deepened with altitude. Not measurably, Solomon was running continuous auspex sweeps, and nothing in the physical data had shifted. The floors were the correct height. The walls were the correct thickness. The materials were the materials they had been built from. And yet the climb felt longer than it was. The landings arrived later than they should. This is a known effect in buildings that have undergone sustained psychic saturation. The human perceptual apparatus, trying to integrate information from environments where the warp has left a residue, begins to experience mild temporal and spatial distortions. Not hallucination, not vision. Simply the sensation that the relationship between effort and outcome is slightly askew, that each step costs a little more than steps should cost. Orun stopped on the first landing. He was pressed against the wall, both hands on his hellgun, and he was staring at the corridor that led off from the landing toward the East Wing dormitories. "There's a voice," he said, very quietly. "In the stairwell. Krail. The wind. The environmental processes. It's saying my name." Nobody moved for a moment. I said, "Orun." He looked at me. "That's my name," I said. "You know my name. Use it. Every time you hear it, the other thing, you say mine. Out loud. You use it as an anchor point." He stared at me with the expression of a man being handed a rope in deep water. Then he nodded. "Voss," he said, testing it. "Archivist Voss." "That's right. Archivist Voss," he said again. And it steadied him. Not completely. Not in the way that safety steadies a person, but in the way that certainty steadies a person, which is different and sometimes more useful. He pushed off the wall. We continued climbing. I wrote. The first moment I acted as something other than a witness. I gave someone an anchor. I do not know if this is my function or a deviation from it. I am writing it down either way. The scriptorium of the second level was a smaller satellite of the main one below, a reading room, essentially, for sisters assigned to the upper floors. We passed through it on the route toward the secondary stairwell that led to the Canoness's sanctum level. It was in this room that Sirene found it. She found it because she was the one who looked at the shelves in the manner of a person who looks at shelves, not for anything specific, but in the comprehensive, habitual way of someone who has learned that what matters is usually not what you were looking for, a personal skill or a personal survival strategy. She reached past a row of standing doctrinal records and withdrew a leather-bound journal. Plain, unmistakable, the kind of journal that is personal rather than institutional. Someone had placed it there with precision, angled spine out, positioned between two taller volumes, in a way that suggested it had been filed for retrieval rather than abandoned. The cover bore an inscription in the careful high Gothic script of a senior ecclesiastical official. The letters formed with the deliberate beauty of someone for whom writing is a sacred act. personal meditations, and private observations. Canoness. Vesper Auric, Order of the Fractured Chalice, Reliquary of the Blind Eye. Sirene handed it to me. I am an archivist. A journal left in a position to be found is a document that wants to be read. I read it in the reading room of the second level, standing in the infected yellow-green light from the narrow windows, while Crail moved through the space, checking the adjoining rooms, and Solmund interfaced with the secondary cogitator terminal, and Orun stood at the door and said my name quietly to himself at irregular intervals, a private litany of the particular faith available to frightened young soldiers in the 41st millennium. The faith that ordinary human things, names, faces, the sound of a voice they know, are real and present, and will continue to be real and present. The journal had 14 entries. I will not reproduce them in their entirety. I will record what was essential, because the journal was eventually taken from me, along with everything else, and what I am writing now is from memory. And memory is not the same as record, but it is what remains when record has been confiscated. The Canoness was an exceptional writer. I record this not as flattery of the dead, but as a relevant datum. A woman of exceptional clarity and precision wrote these words, and they said what she meant them to say, and what they said was this. Day 1. The cult's warp working has begun in earnest. The pressure is psychic, sustained, low frequency, the kind of siege working that does not break a door, but loosens the hinges over time. Faith is armor. We will hold. I am confident. The sisters are strong. Day 3. Sister Hospitaller. Dara asked me a question I did not have an adequate answer for. She asked, if the Emperor hears us, Canoness, why has he not answered? I told her the Emperor's silence is itself an answer, that our suffering is sustained by him, witnessed by him, that the silence is not absence, but a form of presence so immense it does not require our verification. I believe this. I have believed this for 40 years. Tonight, alone in the sanctum, I said it aloud to myself, and I could not feel the weight of it the way I could feel it before. The words were correct. The weight was reduced. Day 7. The dreams are the same every night. I am kneeling before the golden throne. The Emperor is present. I know he is present. I can feel the enormity of his presence, which is the presence of a thing so vast that individual attention within it is not perceptible at the scale of a single person. And that is the horror of the dream. I am kneeling before something true and immense and utterly indifferent to the specific fact of me. Not cruel, not absent, simply oriented elsewhere. I wake and I know this is the warp's work, a constructed psychic impression delivered through my dreaming mind, designed to undermine my certainty. I know this. The knowing does not stop the feeling. The knowing sits in the mind, and the feeling sits in the body, and they do not share a border. Day 10. I have understood something that I do not want to have understood. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Every catechism says this. Every confessor says this. Faith is the practice of acting as though you believe, even in the dark, even in the silence. But the warp working we are under is not attacking our belief. It is not tempting us toward heresy or corruption or the ruinous powers. It is doing something more elegant and more terrible. It is removing the felt benefit of faith. We practice faith correctly. We do all the right things. We feel nothing. We are going through the motions of certainty in a room that has been acoustically altered, so the motions produce no sound. We are the correct instrument. The instrument is played correctly. The room does not allow the note. This is not corruption. I want that recorded. This is not corruption. This is what sophisticated warp siege looks like, and I do not know how to answer it. And for the first time in 40 years of service, I am frightened in a way that has nothing to do with death. Day 14. I have had an idea. It came to me during the midnight office, during the litany of the steadfast, which we have been repeating because the sisters find the repetition steadying. The idea frightens me. I am a senior ecclesiastical officer of the Adepta Sororitas, and I have a responsibility to the doctrinal integrity of my order, and what I am about to do exists in a category I cannot definitively locate within that doctrinal framework. But I have also spent 40 years in service to the Emperor, and I know, with the knowledge that is not belief, but the product of long experience with things larger than comprehension, I know that he cannot attend to every fire at once. He is doing the impossible thing, the thing that must be done, and he is doing it at a cost that no living person can calculate, and his attention is finite in ways that the Catechism does not acknowledge because the Catechism was written to strengthen faith, not to describe the Emperor accurately. I know this, and I know that the sisters cannot hold if the faith as feeling continues to dissolve. So I am going to do something. I am going to build something. It will probably not be doctrinal. I no longer have the time to determine if it is heretical. I know my intentions. I know what I am trying to do. I am going to do it. And if I am wrong, the Emperor will know I was wrong and know why. And I believe that knowledge matters. I believe he can tell the difference between a woman acting faithfully in error and a woman acting faithlessly in certainty. And I believe the distinction matters even to a god, especially to a god, particularly to one who has spent 10,000 years on a throne. That is the last entry. I stood in the reading room for a long time after I finished. Sirene, who had been waiting by the door and had seen my face while I read, said nothing. She put her hand briefly on my arm. The gesture of a person who cannot offer comfort and knows it, and offers contact instead, which is sometimes the only honest comfort available. From below us, from the ground floor, from the direction of the chapel, the singing began. It arrived as a pressure first, the way very low sound arrives, felt before heard, a subsonic warmth that moved through the stone of the floor and up through the soles of the boots and into the body before the ears registered it as coherent, and then it organized itself into the litany of the steadfast. Yes, the same one, the same second verse, the same 48-second loop, but changed in quality, changed in a way that took me several seconds to identify, because it was a change not of note or key or tempo, but of time. It was half speed, not quite. Perhaps 40% reduction from the standard liturgical tempo, just enough that the intervals between notes, which in standard tempo produced the feeling of forward movement, of a melody going somewhere, arriving at a conclusion, resolving, now stretched open. The intervals became spaces. The spaces became rooms. The melody, moving at this tempo, did not arrive anywhere. It moved through space without arriving. It was the litany of the steadfast, as it would sound if the steadfast had stopped expecting anything at the other end of their steadfastness, and had decided that the steadfastness itself was the point, and had adjusted their pace accordingly. It was the most disturbing sound I have ever heard, and I have been present at the documented aftermath of 3 separate chaos cult massacres, and 1 partial demonic incursion. Those sounds were disturbing in the way that visible violence is disturbing. This was disturbing in the way that a mirror is disturbing when you look at it too long and begin to suspect that the face looking back has been making its own decisions. Oren said, "Voss." "Yes," I said. "I hear it." "It's..." "Yes." Krail was already at the corridor door. "Second level. We need the stairwell to the Canoness's sanctum, now." He was not running. He never ran, I would come to understand, because running communicates panic to the people behind you. and Crail had constituted himself as the thing that did not communicate panic. But he was moving with a different quality of speed. The speed of a man who has heard something he wants to be further from. We moved into the corridor. The stairwell was ahead, 20 meters. Through the slit windows along the corridor's outer wall, the infected sky had darkened. Whether evening or the cloud thickening, it was impossible to tell. The corridor was darker than it had been, the suit lumens working harder, the darkness at the edges of the light slightly less retreating and slightly more present. We were 15 meters from the stairwell door. The door opened. Nobody had been on the stairs. We had checked. Solman's Auspex had cleared the stairwell 30 minutes prior. The door opened from the other side, slowly, the way a door opens when the person opening it is in no hurry. When the person opening it has nowhere to be that they are not already. And in the doorframe, a sister of battle in full power armor, white and gold, not a mark on it. Pristine in the manner of armor that has been maintained with devotional care through 14 days of whatever had happened in this building. Her visor was raised. Her face was that of a woman approximately my age, with dark eyes and an expression of absolute terrifying composure. She looked at each of us in turn, unhurried, the look of a person confirming an expected thing. She said, "The Canoness is waiting for you in the Sanctuary Majoris." A pause. She said you would come. Another pause. She moved the cogitator. The singing from below grew neither louder nor softer. It simply continued, patient as stone, patient as the silence had been before the singing began. Patient in the way of things that have stopped keeping track of time because time has ceased to be a variable they need to manage. "She thought you would want to see what she built," the sister said. "Before you left. She said she worked very hard on it." Oren's voice, barely above a breath. "Voss." I said his name back. I kept my eyes on the sister in the doorframe. I wrote nothing. For the first time since we entered the reliquary, I did not write anything down. My stylus was in my hand, and the logbook was open, and I did not write. Some things, in the moment of their happening, resist documentation. Not because they are beyond language, because the act of writing would require looking down, and I could not look down. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was looking at. "Traveler of the Void, you have descended with us into the House of Silent Women. You have read the Canoness's words in the reading room of the second level. You have heard the litany slowed to the tempo of things that have stopped expecting arrival. And now a door is opened that was not opened, and a woman stands in it who should not be there. And she is telling us, that the Canoness worked very hard and wants you to see. Secure the Geller field, traveler. Mark this chronicle with your approval. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors and let the bell of notification ring across the void. Because Chapter 3 is where we find out what faith builds in the dark when no one is watching, and what it costs to look at it. We do not look away here. We document everything. Stand by. Chapter 3. The Liturgy of the Hollow. Her name, she told us eventually, was sister-proclaimed Aveth. She told us this on the stairs, going down, because the Sanctuary Majoris was on the ground floor, and the ground floor was below us, and the direction of the Canoness's invitation was therefore downward, and Sister Aveth walked ahead of us, without hurrying and without looking back, in the manner of someone who is not leading so much as preceding, making the route visible by occupying it. She told us her name when Crail asked, which he did in the tone of a man who asks, because he has been trained to establish basic facts first, and who understood that the answer might matter later, and whose understanding of later at this point encompassed approximately 46 hours before orbital fire. She said it without turning around. Aveth, sister proclaimed, 15 years in the order. Proclaimed. the rank given to sisters who have taken an additional vow beyond the standard sororitas oaths, a personal covenant, specific and private, between the sister and the emperor. Its content was never recorded externally, only the fact of it. The name was the record. I thought about this as we descended, that there is a category of promise so specific and so sacred that the Imperium's vast bureaucratic apparatus, which records everything, catalogues everything, files everything in triplicate against the eventual heat death of individual memory, had decided not to record it. That some things are held only in the relationship between the person who made them and the thing they made them to. And what happens to those promises when the silence stretches long enough to have a shape? I wrote this in the logbook while walking, which is a skill developed over 4 years of documenting things that do not wait for you to stand still. My handwriting on moving stairs is illegible to anyone except me, and sometimes to me. This is acceptable. The purpose of documentation in the field is not readability, it is continuity. The record continues even when the hand cannot be steady. Sister Aveth's armor was pristine in a way I kept returning to. 14 days inside a warp-pressured building, in a community that had, by the evidence of everything we had seen, undergone significant psychological and spiritual reorganization, and her armor was maintained with the care of a ceremonial inspection. Every surface, not a scratch unpolished, not a seal unserviced, not a prayer inscription unreadable. I am not a military person, but I have documented enough military situations to understand what armor care means at the level of discipline it takes to maintain it. It is a form of faith in the continuation of the self. You maintain your armor because you believe there will be a future version of you that requires it, because the future version of you is worth preparing for. She had kept her armor perfect for 14 days in a building where 40 women had decided the doctrinal codices were more honestly displayed face down. She had done this alongside that, had participated in whatever the community had undergone, and had also, every evening or every morning, or at whatever interval her personal protocol dictated, maintained her armor. As though two things could be true at once, that the structure had failed, and that the structure was worth maintaining. I did not know yet whether this was wisdom or the saddest thing I had ever seen. The answer I would discover was both. The answers in this building were always both. The ground floor corridor that led to the Sanctuary Majoris was the widest in the reliquary, designed for processional movement at scale. The approach corridor for large formal liturgical events, capable of accommodating the full complement of the order in ceremonial configuration. It ran east-west, terminating at the great iron doors of the sanctuary, and it was lined along both walls with what I can only describe as stations, alcoves carved into the ferrocrete, each holding a devotional object or icon, each framed by a small pair of lumen strip fixtures that would, when functioning, cast an individual illuminating pool around each station. The lumen strips were all dark, but each station had been supplemented, recently within days, by the freshness of the materials, with candles. Not the standard ecclesiastical candles of the order's ceremonial stores, though those were present too, burned to stubs. These were improvised. Strips of promethium-soaked wicking in metal cups, crude and functional. The kind of light source you make when the approved light sources have run out and the dark is unacceptable. They had burned down, almost all of them. The wax, the tallow, the promethium, all consumed. The cups held the residue of light rather than light itself, and in each alcove, the devotional object or icon that the station was built to display had been, not removed, covered. White cloth, cut from what appeared to be undersuit material. Each icon, each figurine, each framed illuminated page of approved devotional art, covered. White, silent, not destroyed. Covered. The way you cover something you cannot look at and cannot bring yourself to remove. The way grief covers a mirror in a house of mourning. Not denial, the thing is still there, under the cloth, but the acknowledgement that you cannot currently sustain the relationship the object demands of you. And the covering is the honest response to that, more honest than pretending the relationship is intact. I have thought about this detail more than any other in the building. The covered icons. Because destruction would have indicated rejection, the severing of a relationship, and the face-down manuscripts indicated something similar, the turning away from a thing that had failed you. But covering is the gesture of someone who believes the relationship might resume, who is not ready to look but has not given up on looking, who is in the middle of something and does not know yet whether they will come out the other side in a condition to reopen their eyes. The covered icons were hopeful, specific, agonized, uncertain hope, the hope of people who have not decided yet. Aveth walked past them without looking. She had made her decision, whatever it was. The covered icons were for people still deciding. She had moved on. I looked at everyone. The singing had continued the entire length of the descent and the approach, the slowed litany of the steadfast, from beneath us, from inside the sanctuary, its patience unchanged, its tempo unchanged, its quality of something that has stopped expecting arrival entirely unchanged. And as we approached the great iron doors, it changed in a way that was not volume, but texture. The individual voices became distinguishable, not because they had separated from each other. They remained in unison, perfect communal unison, the kind of unison that 40 people trained for years in the liturgical arts can produce, where the individual voice disappears entirely into the collective voice, and the collective voice becomes a single instrument of extraordinary range and depth. But each voice was audible within the unison, the way individual threads are visible in cloth if you look at it from the right angle, not separate, just a present. Each one sustains its part of the whole, each one identifiable as a specific person rather than a generic component. This particular timbre, this specific breath pattern, this voice shaped by this body over this lifetime of devotion. 40 individual voices, one sound, both things at once. The doors were warm. Crail put his hand on the left panel and held it there for a moment, his palm flat against the iron. His face was the face of a man receiving information he would prefer not to have received. He said without turning, "Solmund." Solmund had his auspex extended. He looked at the reading, and he looked at the door, and he said, "No demonic presence, no chaos entity signatures. Warp energy elevated, significantly elevated, the highest reading we have encountered in this structure. But the energy is of human origin. I am confident of this characterization. It is concentrated, focused, as though..." He paused. His mechadendrites made the outward spreading gesture of uncertainty I had catalogued on the lighter, as though someone has been deliberately and consistently directing it toward a specific point. "For how long?" Crail asked. "At this intensity, based on the saturation pattern in the surrounding materials." Another pause. "Approximately 12 days. We stood in front of the doors for a moment. The singing on the other side, the warmth of the iron. Orun said my name. "Yes," I said. "I'm here." He nodded. He gripped his hellgun and looked at the doors with the expression of a young man who has decided that the thing on the other side is less dangerous than the thing already inside him, which was fear, which he had been managing with my name and with the discipline of his training, and which had been doing very well until approximately this moment. He was holding it. He would continue to hold it. He was, I thought, the second bravest person in the building, after the Canoness, for reasons I would understand shortly. Crail pushed the door open. The Sanctuary Majoris of the Reliquary of the Blind Eye was designed to hold 500 souls in formal processional configuration, which meant it was vast in the manner of spaces built for devotion at institutional scale. The vaulted ceiling rose to 30 meters at the apex, supported by columns of dark stone carved with the continuous narrative of the Order's spiritual history, and the floor was laid in the alternating white and black stone that the Order used to represent the binary of faith and doubt, light and dark, the eternal opposition that devotion was supposed to resolve in favor of the light. The architectural intent was clear. You entered this space small, and the space made you smaller, and the smallness was the point, not to diminish, but to calibrate, to give the worshipper an accurate sense of their scale relative to the things they were worshipping. The ceiling's apex was in darkness. The columns were in darkness. The far end of the space where the primary altar should have stood was in darkness so complete that the wall was not visible at all. The space simply ended in black at a distance I estimated at 60 meters, but could not confirm. What was visible, what the darkness was organized around, what the darkness framed with the precision of a stage set, was the center of the sanctuary floor. The candles were here, not the improvised ones from the corridor. These were proper ecclesiastical candles, the tall devotional kind from the Order's stores, and they had been arranged in a circle approximately 15 meters in diameter, hundreds of them, burned low but still lit, their combined illumination casting the interior of the circle in a warm amber light that was the only warmth in the building. It was the warmth of a thing that tended. The candles had been replaced as they burned down. There was evidence of this in the wax patterns on the floor, the layers of different burns, the careful maintenance of an ongoing fire that had been sustained for days. Inside the circle, 40 sisters of battle, standing, in full power armor, facing inwardly, in a ring of their own, a ring within the ring of candles, their backs to us, their faces directed toward the center, and at the center, what I saw, and could not for a long moment name. She had built a throne, not large, not grand, not the size of a piece of architecture, the size of a piece of furniture, a chair in the most fundamental sense, a seat, a back, 2 arms, elevated on a platform she had constructed from the stacked doctrinal codices taken from the scriptorium, the face-down manuscripts repurposed as the foundation of something rather than discarded, which meant she had not abandoned the words. She had put them under the thing she was building, made them the ground it stood on. The throne itself had been assembled from components that I could, with effort, identify. The back was the decorative grille from a promethium heater, bent and shaped. The arms were sections of the column work, removed from a damaged pillar and fitted by someone with either significant physical strength or several days of determined effort. The seat was cushioned with white cloth, the same white cloth that covered the icons in the corridor, layered and arranged with care. The whole structure was perhaps 1.5 meters tall and had been constructed with the precision of someone who did not know how to build a throne and had decided to learn. It was, in the amber light of the candles, extraordinary. Not beautiful, not in the aesthetic sense, in the sense of a thing that has been made by someone who cared about it more than they cared about anything else at the moment of making it, which is the quality that makes things matter regardless of their technique. Vesper Auric had made this throne with 40 years of faith and 14 days of silence, and the specific desperation of someone who has found that doing nothing is no longer a position they can occupy. The throne was empty. Beside it, standing rather than kneeling, standing with her hands at her sides in the posture of a woman who has finished something, was the Canoness. Vesper Auric was 61 years old. The mission dossier had told me this. The dossier had also told me she was a decorated combat veteran, of 7 significant engagements, the recipient of the Macharian Cross and 2 lesser honors, and the ranking ecclesiastical authority for the order on Volundris IV. The dossier had not told me what she looked like, because the dossier did not consider this operationally relevant. She was a woman who had been handsome and had stopped caring about it, and had therefore become striking. The architecture of a face that is no longer performing anything, that simply is what it has become after 6 decades of being lived in. White hair, cut short, practical. A burn scar along the left side of her jaw, old enough to have settled into the skin as simply a feature of her, rather than an event that had happened to her. Eyes the color of deep water, in a world with a proper sun, which Volundris IV was not. Grey-green, specific. The eyes of a woman who looks at things in order to see them, rather than to confirm what she already expects. She looked at us when we entered. The 40 sisters did not move. The singing did not change. She waited until we had crossed the floor to the edge of the candle ring. She waited with the patience of a woman who has, in the last 14 days, fundamentally renegotiated her relationship with time. Then she said, "You are the retrieval team." Crail, "Yes." "The cogitator is on the throne. You may take it." She indicated it with a gesture of her hand. A small movement, precise. The encrypted battle cogitator was visible now that I looked, placed on the seat of the throne within the white cloth, a black rectangular unit with its indicator light blinking amber in the candlelight. She had placed it there. She had moved it from the sanctum specifically to here, to this location, so that the retrieval team would have to come to this room to collect it, so that the retrieval team would see what she had built. "I suspected you would be sent for it eventually." "Crail, we need to take it and leave. We have a limited extraction window." "I know. They will bombard the site." "Not a question." 48 hours from insertion, yes. They always do. This is the standard inquisitorial response to a situation they cannot categorize. A pause. "I want to tell you what this is, before you take the cogitator and before the bombardment. I want someone to understand what this is, and you are the people who are here, so you will have to be sufficient." Her eyes moved from Crail, to me, to the logbook in my hands. "You are the archivist." "Yes." "Write this down." I wrote. 12 days ago, the Canoness said, I understood that the warp siege we were under was not attacking our belief. I have explained this in my journal, which I left where it would be found, because I wanted the explanation to survive even if I did not. The work was not corrupt. It was not a temptation toward the ruinous powers. It was something more specific and more elegant. It was the removal of the felt benefit of faith. It was an attack not on what we believed, but on our ability to experience our belief as real. We still believed. We did everything correctly. We felt nothing. And an army that feels nothing is an army that is already losing, not to the enemy, but to itself. The 40 sisters continued to sing, the slowed litany. The patience of it, behind her words, was not interruption, but accompaniment. The proof of what she was saying, sung in real time. I faced a command decision. My sisters were degrading, not in faith, not in discipline, not in competence, but in the capacity to feel that any of it mattered. And I had no reinforcement coming, no Vox contact, no sign that the Imperium was aware of our situation or capable of addressing it within a relevant time frame. I could maintain correct procedure until correct procedure became a performance conducted by automatons, or I could find another way. "You built the throne," I said. "I built the throne." She looked at it. The expression was not pride exactly, closer to the expression of a person looking at something they made in the middle of the night in a condition of extremity and are now seeing in full light for the first time, assessing it honestly. I could not give my sisters the feeling of divine presence. I am not sanctioned. I am not a psyker. I cannot reach into the warp and pull the Emperor's attention back from wherever his attention is required at greater scale. But I know something about faith that the Catechism does not fully articulate. Faith does not require the object of faith to be present. Faith generates its own object through the act of faithful practice. We have been doing this for 10,000 years. Every prayer said into silence is an act of construction. It builds a space where the thing prayed to can, potentially, arrive. The building of the space is the act of faith. The arrival is secondary. Solomon was running his auspex continuously. His face, in the amber candlelight, was the face of a Mechanicus adept confronting data that significantly exceeds his prepared interpretive frameworks, which is the closest thing to awe that the Mechanicus officially permits. I built a throne, the Canoness continued, because the throne is the point of contact. The throne is the place where the Emperor's presence is, in the imperial understanding, most concentrated, not because he chose the throne, but because we chose it. 10,000 years of collective devotion directed at that location has made it real as a psychic object, regardless of whatever is physically there. I built a scale model of the object of 10,000 years of human devotion, and I gave my sisters something specific to direct their faith toward, and I asked them to direct it. And, Crail said, and they did. 40 trained sisters, full liturgical devotion, directed at a specific constructed focal point for 12 days. You have the auspex reading. She looked at Solomon. You told him what you found. Solomon. I reported elevated psychic energy concentration of human origin, directed toward. It worked, the Canoness said simply. Not the way the Catechism describes working, not an intervention, not a sign, not a voice from the throne, or a vision, or a miracle of the kind the hagiographies prefer. What happened was, she paused. For the first time in the conversation, she paused to find words rather than to deliver them. The feeling came back. We prayed at the throne, and the feeling that the prayer meant something, that the thing we were addressing was real and present and aware, came back. Not because the Emperor came. I am not claiming that. I am claiming that the construction of the space generated sufficient psychic mass through sustained and disciplined devotion that the space became self-sustaining. The object of faith does not need to be physically present if the faith itself generates sufficient reality. The silence in which this landed was different from the silences that had preceded it. The other silences had been the silences of dread. This one was the silence of something that had been said correctly and was now present in the room in the way that true things are present. Not comfortably, not reassuringly, but solidly, as a weight that has been set down. Crail said, that is unsanctioned psychic activity. Yes. Conducted by non-sanctioned individuals. Yes. Though I would note that the distinction between sanctioned and unsanctioned psychic activity in this context is a bureaucratic distinction rather than a substantive one. The activity is the same. The paperwork is different. The paperwork exists for a reason. The paperwork exists because the Imperium cannot supervise 10 trillion people individually and therefore requires categories, and the categories require documentation, and the documentation requires time, and time is what we did not have. She said this without heat, without argument, as a statement of logistics. I made a command decision. I had command authority. I decided that functional sisters, with a sustainable relationship to their faith, were more valuable to the Emperor's purposes than 40 automatons performing a correct procedure into a void. I may have been wrong. I was not reckless. I was not faithless. I was a senior officer doing the available thing with the available resources. I need to stop here and record something that is not the Canoness's words, because the Canoness's words are in the battle cogitator, and in my logbook, and in my memory, and they will survive in various forms. What I need to record is what happened to Orun Tal in the Sanctuary Majoris, because it happened quietly, and to the side of the main conversation, and it is the thing I think about most when I think about those hours. Orun had been holding his hellgun since we entered. He had been holding my name in his mouth like a stone, saying it every few minutes, quietly, the way you hold something that keeps you from floating away. He had been doing this since the stairwell, and he had been doing it well, with the determined competence of someone who has been given a tool and has used it correctly. In the sanctuary, he stopped. Not because he had lost his grip, not because the thing in the singing had broken through. He stopped saying my name because he had stopped needing it. I noticed this at some point during the Canoness's explanation, and I looked at him, and his face was different from the face he had been wearing since before the lighter. The face he had been wearing since the moment Lieutenant whatever his name was in training had told him what the ruinous powers were, and what they did to people, and had watched him file this information into the category of things I will carry forever now. His face was calm, not the calm of someone who has stopped feeling afraid. The calm of someone who has, in the presence of something they did not expect to find, discovered that the fear was taking up room that something else can occupy. He was looking at the 40 sisters in their ring, listening to them, and what his face said. What it said clearly enough that I did not need to be a doctor or a confessor or any kind of specialist in human states to read it, was, I understand. Not agreement, not conversion, not some doctrinal position on the legitimacy of unsanctioned psychic devotion. Understanding. The understanding of a young man who has been frightened for a very long time, of death, of the warp, of the vast indifferent machine of the Imperium that had conscripted him and pointed him at a hive war, and who has just encountered 40 people who were also frightened, and who did something with the fear instead of simply carrying it. I wrote, Orun Tal has stopped saying my name. He no longer needs the anchor. He has found something to anchor to himself. I do not know yet whether this is a good thing or a dangerous one. In this building, the distinction has been difficult to maintain. Krail's hand was at his sidearm. It had been moving there for several minutes, the slow, continuous drift of a hand that has received an order and is executing it in the deliberate manner of a man who takes no pleasure in the execution. His face was the face of a soldier in the exact position that soldiers are designed to be uncomfortable in, at the intersection of an order and a question, where the order is clear, and the question makes the order difficult to complete without first answering the question. And the question is this right? He stopped with his hand on the weapon. He said, I have orders. The Canoness. I know. The Colonel's briefing. I know what the briefing said. They always say the same things. They cannot categorize what happened here, and they are afraid of it, and they are going to sterilize it from orbit because sterilization is the Imperium's answer to things it cannot categorize. This is not cruelty. It is systems management. I understand it. She looked at him steadily. Do it if you need to. I made peace with this possibility on day 4. Krail's hand did not move. I said his name. Not as an anchor. I did not have the authority to anchor Krail, who was a Sergeant Primus with 15 years of service and a command structure above him that I was very much not part of. I said his name because I had a question, and the question needed to be asked by someone, and I was the one who was there. Krail. He looked at me. Is it corrupted? A pause. Solmund. Is there chaos influence, taint, ruinous powers, anything active in this room? Solmund's auspex. his mechadendrites very still. The reading taking 3 full seconds. No demonic presence, no active malign warp entity, no corruption signatures consistent with chaos-aligned influence. The psychic energy in this space is of exclusively human origin, generated through sustained devotional practice directed toward a constructed focal point. There is no... He stopped. Then, with the deliberateness of a Mechanicus adept choosing accuracy over comfort, there is nothing here that the Inquisition's standard instruments would classify as warp taint. Then what? I said, and my voice was louder than I intended, or exactly as loud as the situation required, and I could not in that moment tell the difference. Are we executing them for? The singing continued. The candles burned. The throne sat empty in the amber light, the cogitator on its seat blinking. Krail said, "Because High Command..." High Command said there was doubt here. Those were the exact words. Not corruption, not taint, not heresy of the ruinous powers. Doubt. And we are standing in a room where 40 women went through 14 days of silence and built something to fill it with, and built it correctly, and built it faithfully, and there is nothing in your auspex that says otherwise, and you are going to... Voss. Write it down, I said. At minimum. Let me write it down. Whatever else you decide, let me write down what actually happened here before you make it impossible to describe. The silence after this was the longest in the building. Not the settled silence of the building itself, a human silence. The silence of 3 people, and 1 Mechanicus adept, and 40 singing sisters, and 1 Canoness in a circle of candles, and the weight of a decision hanging in the amber light like smoke. Krail's hand moved away from his weapon. He said nothing. He crossed to the throne. He picked up the cogitator. He held it for a moment, looking at the empty seat where it had rested. Then he turned and looked at the Canoness and said, in a voice that I will never be able to reproduce on paper, because paper cannot hold the specific quality of a voice, making a promise it knows it cannot keep. Take your sisters and get out of the building. The bombardment window is 46 hours. Get as far as you can. The Canoness said, there is nowhere far enough. I know, Krail said. She nodded once, as though this was the expected answer, and she had simply needed to confirm that he knew it too, that they were both clear on what was being offered, and what it could and could not accomplish. Thank you, she said, for asking the question. I didn't ask it, he said. She did. He looked at me. I looked at the logbook in my hands. I had been writing the entire time. We should have left then. We should have taken the cogitator, moved to the stairwell, regrouped at the processional corridor, and begun the 2-kilometer return to the LZ at a pace consistent with reaching extraction altitude before the bombardment window closed. We did not leave because the throne activated. I want to be precise about this, because I have been asked to be precise about this by every person who has reviewed my account, and my answer has been the same each time. I do not know the mechanism. I cannot describe it in the vocabulary of the Mechanicus or the Inquisition or the Adeptus Astra Telepathica or any other sanctioned technical framework, because none of those frameworks were present for what happened, and I am an archivist, and I document what is there rather than imposing the vocabulary of what should be there. What I can describe, the throne produced light. Amber initially, the same amber as the candles. Close enough that for the first half-second I thought it was reflected candlelight from the polished surface of the promethium grille that formed the back. Then different. Warmer, deeper, the particular quality of light that originates rather than reflects. The light came from the seat of the throne, from the place where the cogitator had rested, and which was now empty. The 40 sisters turned toward it, simultaneously, without coordination, without signal, simply turned, as though the light had addressed them individually, and they had each responded. Their faces were visible now. 40 faces in the amber-warm glow, each one specific, each one the face of a person who's been holding something for a very long time, and is now in the presence of something that is offering to hold it with them. Not take it, hold it with them. The distinction was in their expressions. They did not look relieved. They looked accompanied. The Canoness looked at the throne, and her face did a thing I could not document in language and did not try to. Some things you write around. Krael stepped back. One step, involuntary. The step of a man whose body has received information his training has not prepared a response for, and has defaulted to the response of the animal. Increased distance from the unknown. Solman's auspex emitted a sound it had not made before. A sharp, ascending tone, the alert of an instrument exceeding its measurement range. He looked at the reading. He said very quietly, in the voice of a mechanicus adept standing at the edge of everything his tradition has prepared him for. The psychic energy concentration has increased by a factor of... He stopped. The instrument does not have a range adequate to the current reading. The light from the throne was warm on my face. My logbook was open. The stylus was moving. I was writing, and I did not know I was writing until I looked down and read what I had written. It is doing what the candles could not do alone. The space is sufficient. The thing prayed toward has enough reality now to... And then Seren screamed. Not in pain, not in fear. The scream of someone whose interior architecture has been rearranged without warning, as though the floor of a room they had been standing in very carefully has shifted. And the standing was careful, because they knew about the floor. And now the floor is different. And the knowledge that the floor could be different is what the scream is about. She was at the edge of the candle ring, 2 meters to my right, and the throne's light had reached her directly. The geometry of the room had placed her in the direct line of it, and whatever the light was doing in the room, it was doing to her first, at highest intensity. Hey, she was on her feet. She was not falling. She was not moving toward or away from anything. She was simply screaming once, and then the scream stopped, and she was quiet. Too quiet. She turned toward the throne. Her face was, I have to be accurate here. Her face was the face of someone who has seen something at a very great distance and has decided that the distance is where they want to be. Her eyes were open and focused, and looking at something that was not in the Sanctuary Majoris. Not glassy, not vacant, occupied. Occupied by something else, something she had found or that had found her. Something at the end of a very long line of sight, that the throne's light had opened, and that Seren had looked through before she understood what she was looking at. The light diminished. The throne subsided to candlelight. The sisters lowered their eyes from the light, and some of them were weeping, and none of them were otherwise changed. Seren remained where she was, looking at the distance. Krael crossed to her in 2 strides. Halt, halt, report. He put his hands on her shoulders. She looked at him. The eyes moved to his face, and they were clear, and they were hers, and they saw him. I'm here, she said. What happened? She thought about this for a moment with the deliberateness of a woman translating from one language into another. I saw something, she said. I don't have words for it. I'm here. She was. Her body was there, upright, functional, biometric stable according to Solman's immediate assessment. Her training was there. She moved when Krael indicated movement. She held her weapon correctly. She oriented toward exits with the automatic competence of years of drilled response. But her face, from that moment forward, held the expression of someone who has decided to stay somewhere they had glimpsed, who is physically present and attentionally elsewhere. Who is managing the distance between those two locations with the same careful discipline that Aveth applied to her armor maintenance? I looked at the Canoness. She was watching Sirene with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who knows exactly what has happened and is not certain yet whether it is a gift or a harm. "She will be all right," the Canoness said. "She saw what we all saw. She just saw it first and alone, and that is always harder." Krail: "What did she see?" "Evidence," the Canoness said simply, "that the space is real." Krail looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the throne. Then he looked at the cogitator in his hands. The black unit, blinking amber, containing 3 months of a war that the Administratum was going to erase from its records. And he said, "We need to leave. Now." He turned for the door. Behind us, the 40 sisters of the Order of the Fractured Chalice arranged themselves around the throne in the candlelight, and their singing resumed. But it was different now. Still the Litany of the Steadfast. Still the second verse. But the tempo had changed. It was full speed. The note arrived. The melody resolved. The thing moved forward and arrived at its conclusion, and began again with the feeling of something that has found its direction, and is moving in it, and is not going to stop. I stood in the doorway of the Sanctuary Majoris, and listened to it for 3 full seconds that I could not afford, and then I followed the others into the dark of the corridor, and behind me the great iron doors swung slowly inward, and the warmth of the candles and the sound of the singing diminished, and the darkness of the corridor received us, and I wrote in my logbook, moving at the pace of people who have approximately 45 hours before the sky opens. The throne is not empty anymore. I do not know what is in it. I know what the Canoness built it for. I know she built it from the materials of her faith and the labor of her hands and the refusal to accept that silence is the same as absence. I know she built it correctly. I know what Solmon's Auspex found and did not find. I know what Sirene's face looked like when she saw what she saw. I do not know what to call what happened in the Sanctuary Majoris. I know what it felt like. It felt like the right question, finally, receiving an answer. Whether the answer came from outside or was generated from within by the accumulated force of 40 faithful people who had decided that the distinction no longer mattered, I cannot determine. I am an archivist. I document what is there. What was there was warmth and light, and 40 women singing at full speed, and a throne that was not empty, and a specialist named Sirene Hall who will spend the rest of her life looking at a distance I cannot follow her to.
What was there was real.
I was there. I am writing it down. Traveler of the Void, you have stood in the Sanctuary Majoris. You have heard what the Canoness built and why she built it. You have seen Sirene Hall look into a distance that had no name. You have heard the litany resume at full speed. The choir is still singing, traveler, as we climb toward the exit. The cogitator is in our hands. The bombardment clock is moving, and we have 45 hours to discover the price of what we witnessed and what it costs to carry it out into the light. Secure the Gellerfield. Mark this chronicle. Join the crew. Sound the bell. The Voidborn Terror's crew does not leave its witnesses alone. Chapter 4 begins in the corridor. The doors are closing behind us. 45 hours. Stand by. Chapter 4. What faith builds in the dark. The corridor received us the way corridors in that building received everything. Without comment, without change, in the settled silence of a space that has decided it is done being surprised. Behind us, the iron doors had swung to their resting position, not fully closed, not fully open. Ajar. The singing came through the gap as a thin, warm thread of sound. Full tempo now. The litany of the steadfast moving at the speed of something that has found its direction. and the warmth of the candles came with it, a faint amber glow visible in the gap between the doors, the only warm light in the building that wasn't a suit lumen. Krail was already moving. The cogitator was in his left hand, his hellgun in his right, and his pace had the quality I had learned to read in him over the past several hours. Not running, never running, but the deliberate acceleration of a man who has made a decision and is now in the business of executing it before he can fully process what the decision cost him. The prayer beads were in neither hand. I did not know where they had gone. I did not ask. Siren walked. This was the correct word and the insufficient word simultaneously. Her legs moved in the correct sequence at the correct pace, with the correct postural discipline of a trained Tempestus scion on active operation. Everything her training had built was still functioning. It was functioning in the way that a building continues to function after the people inside it have left. The lights still on, the environmental systems still cycling, the structure still standing, inhabited by process rather than presence. Her eyes were forward. They saw the corridor. They did not see only the corridor. I stayed level with her. I did not speak to her. I did not know yet what to say to someone who had looked through a door I had not seen opened. And I have learned, in 4 years of documenting extreme situations, that the impulse to fill silence with words is usually about the person doing the filling, rather than the person who needs the silence. I stayed level with her, and I wrote, and the act of writing was the only honest companionship I had available. Orun was behind us. He had not said my name since the sanctuary, which remained true and remained something I was not certain how to characterize. He was quiet in a different way from Siren, not absent, not occupied elsewhere, but turned inward in the manner of a young man who has acquired information that significantly reorganizes his interior architecture and is carefully, systematically determining what the new layout means for every room. Solomon moved with the efficiency of a machine that has completed its primary sensor function and is now operating in secondary mode, recording, processing, not yet reporting. His mechadendrites were folded. His auspex was holstered. Whatever the instrument had measured in the Sanctuary Majoris, the measurement was done. We had 45 hours. The processional corridor felt shorter going out. I noticed this and documented it because the opposite had been true coming in. Every approach into the building's interior had felt extended, each corridor stretching slightly beyond its physical measurements in the way of spaces where the warp has left a residue of itself, where the relationship between effort and distance has been subtly altered. The building had been pulling us deeper, the way deep water pulls, not with force, with weight, with the patient's accumulation of pressure. Going out, it did not pull. It was released. I wrote, "The building is not trying to keep us. Whatever it wanted from us, whatever the accumulated devotion inside it was oriented toward, it has received something sufficient. The throne lit. The singing changed tempo. We are being released. I do not know whether to find this reassuring or not. Things that release you after they have finished with you are not always things that wished you well." We passed the covered icons. In the amber glow of our suit lumens, they were what they had been before. White cloth over silent faces, the gesture of people who cannot yet look, but have not given up on looking. I thought of the Canoness's journal. Day 10. We feel nothing. And then the throne in the candlelight, and the singing at full speed, and Vesper Oryx's face doing the thing I had not been able to document in language. She had her answer. 14 days into the silence, with 46 hours until orbital fire, she had her answer. I did not know if this was tragedy or grace. I recorded both possibilities and kept walking. The outer courtyard arrived with the particular shock of spaces that have been outside your body long enough that you have stopped expecting them. The cold came first, the infected yellow-green of the sky, the wrong mud, the smell of copper and ozone that meant warp saturation rather than weather. After the interior of the reliquary, the courtyard felt enormous. The sky felt enormous. The 2 kilometers of ruined approach to the LZ stretched ahead of us under the dim and uncommitted light of a star that had not changed its behavior despite everything that had happened beneath it. The tables were still set, the bowls of congealed gruel. I stopped walking. Krael. Voss. One moment. I crossed to the nearest table. I straightened a bowl that had been sitting at an angle, not knocked over, just settled slightly off-center. The way things settle when they have been sitting untouched for long enough that the surface beneath them has become their permanent relationship. I straightened it, parallel to the edge of the table, in the correct position for a meal that someone had prepared and intended to eat and had not eaten. I do not know why I did this. I wrote it down. I straightened a bowl. I cannot explain this adequately. I think it was the only form of amendment I had available. I think I needed to do one thing in this building that was simply correct, simply tidy, simply the restoration of a small order that did not require anyone to die, or decide, or witness. The bowl is straight. Someone prepared this meal. It is recorded that someone prepared this meal, and that someone else straightened the bowl, and that both of these things happened, and neither of them was nothing. Then I followed the others through the open gate. The gate stood open behind us. I did not look back at it. I looked forward, at the ruined boulevard, at the Vox relay tower in the middle distance, at the infected sky above the approach corridor of devastation that led to the LZ and the lighter and the 45 hours remaining before the sky opened. Orun drew level with me. He said, "I want something recorded. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, assembling it. The care he took was the care of a young man who has discovered that precision matters, that the difference between what you mean and what you say is the difference between being understood and being misunderstood, and that being misunderstood is its own kind of loss. What they did there, the sisters, I want it recorded that it was right, not sanctioned, not doctrinal, not whatever word the Inquisition is going to use when they read your log. Right. They felt nothing, and they built something to feel, and they kept going. That is the bravest thing I have encountered in my service, and my service is 3 years old, so I recognize the limitation of that statement, but I am making it anyway. I wrote it, word for word, as I had promised the Canoness I would write, as I had promised Iseult Dara, as I had been promising myself since Briefing Chamber 9 on the Sovereign of Ruin, when a colonel whose name I never learned said the word doubt, and I understood that doubt was what I was being sent to witness. "It's recorded," I said. He nodded. He did not say anything else for the rest of the approach to the LZ. The Vox relay tower stood at the intersection of the ruined boulevard, exactly where we had passed it on the way in, still dark, still functional, its indicator panel waiting. We passed it. I looked at it. Solmund looked at it longer than I did, in the way of a Mechanicus adept filing a location for future reference, and I thought nothing of this at the time. I thought of it later. I think of it now. The LZ had the lighter where we had left it, the enduring complaint, its hull cooling in the infected air, its ramp indicator dark and waiting. The plasma drives were on standby cycle. The inside would smell of corpse starch and recycled oxygen and promethium, and the specific accumulated humanness of a craft that had been sitting closed and sealed in warp-adjacent atmosphere for 6 hours and counting. It smelled like the most ordinary thing I had encountered since we landed. Krael went up the ramp first, conducted a rapid sweep of the interior, emerged and said, "Clear." We boarded. The ramp rose. The seals engaged. The plasma drives began their warming cycle, the bass thrum of it moving through the deck plates like a heartbeat, mechanical and steady and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the building behind us. Solomon sat with the retrieval unit in his lap and extended 2 mechadendrites toward the cogitator. The decryption process would take the full flight to orbit and beyond. 3 months of encrypted battle intelligence, the Canoness's personal transcripts, the record of everything the Order of the Fractured Chalice had learned about the cult's warp working before the silence came down. He interfaced. He paused. He looked up from the cogitator and said, "There is a problem. The Vox, the lighter's primary Vox array, the channel required to transmit extraction authorization to the Sovereign of Ruin and confirm our approach vector for docking, had been damaged. Not from combat, not from mechanical failure in any standard sense. Solomon's diagnosis took 4 minutes and was delivered with the particular economy of a mechanicus adept describing a situation that is straightforwardly bad and does not benefit from softening. The sustained warp saturation of the southern spire's atmosphere had introduced a low-frequency psychic interference pattern into the Vox array's core components. The interference was not acute. The array still functioned, still transmitted, but the transmission was corrupted at a level that the Sovereign of Ruin's receiver would reject as signal noise. We could broadcast, we could not be heard. The fix was direct physical interface with the Vox relay tower, a ground-based transmission amplified through the tower's hardwired array, bypassing the lighter's damaged components entirely. Manual interface, held continuously for the approximately 40 minutes required for the lighter to achieve orbit and clear the psychic interference zone of the lower atmosphere. Solomon could perform the interface. He was the only one qualified. The problem was the cogitator. The decryption process, once initiated, required continuous mechanicus oversight. The encoded battle intelligence was layered with anti-tampering protocols that would trigger data purge if the interface was interrupted. Solomon could not oversee the decryption and operate the relay simultaneously. He could not be in 2 places. The alternative, he said, was to delay the decryption and transmit first. This was viable, except for one detail he delivered last, without inflection. The relay tower is within the bombardment zone. Manual interface requires a stationary operator at the tower's access port for the full 40 minutes. The lighter cannot wait on the ground for that duration without exceeding the bombardment window. The operator would need to remain at the tower while the lighter achieves orbit. The silence in the cargo bay was the silence of people performing rapid calculations and arriving at the same answer from different directions. Krail said, "I'll do it." "Solomon, you are not mechanicus qualified for the interface." "Then tell me what to do." "The interface requires mechadendrite level contact with the primary coupling. You do not have mechadendrites." The calculation completed itself. The answer sat in the cargo bay with us. Sirene was looking at the middle distance. She had been looking at it since the sanctuary. Her hands were on her weapon with the muscle memory of a decade and a half of training. Her biometrics, per Solomon's assessment, were stable. Her training was intact. Her body was present and functional, and would remain present and functional for the foreseeable future. Her attention was elsewhere. Her attention was, as best I could determine, at the end of the long line of sight that the throne's light had opened, in a space that was warm and amber, and did not have a name in any cartographica I had ever documented. She would not feel 40 minutes at a relay tower in the open air of a warp-saturated war zone as 40 minutes. I did not know this with certainty. I believed it with the certainty of a woman who had watched her face in the sanctuary and understood where she had gone and what she was managing in the distance between there and here. Crail looked at her for a long time. His prayer beads appeared in his hand. I had not seen him retrieve them. They were simply there, the left hand working them with the patient mechanical rhythm I had catalogued from the first moment in Briefing Chamber 9. The tool so familiar it operated without decision, without thought, without the need for the conscious mind to authorize it. He crossed the cargo bay. He stood in front of her. Halt. Her eyes moved to him, clear, present, seeing him. I need you to do something. She listened. He told her. He told her what it meant. Because Crail was the kind of man who told people what things meant, rather than simply issuing the order and allowing the meaning to arrive later, when it was too late to matter. He told her what the relay was, and what the 40 minutes required, and what the bombardment window was, and what the tower's position within it meant. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "All right." Not resignation, not sacrifice in the high dramatic sense of the word. No proclamation, no trembling lip, no final statement for the record. Simply, "All right." The words of a woman who has already traveled a very great distance and has found that the logistics of the return journey are less pressing than they might otherwise be. The words of someone for whom the difference between 40 minutes at a relay tower and whatever comes after 40 minutes at a relay tower is a difference that operates on a scale she has ceased to experience as relevant. I wrote nothing. My stylus was in my hand and my logbook was open, and I wrote nothing. Because some things are not documentation, and some moments are not recorded, and this was one of them. This was Crail standing in front of Sirenhals in the cargo bay of the Enduring Complaint, and telling her a true thing, and her receiving it, and saying all right, and the prayer beads in his left hand, working their patient mechanical rhythm, and the bass thrum of the plasma drives through the deck plates, and 44 hours remaining on a bombardment clock that did not care what any of us had witnessed. She took the maintenance access kit from Solmond. She memorized the interface sequence. 4 repetitions, Solmond confirming each time, her retention perfect and immediate. The training still there. The training always still there. She checked her armor seals. She pulled her visor down. At the top of the ramp she stopped. She turned back to us. She did not look at Crail. She looked at me. She said, "Write it down." "All of it," I said. "All of it." The ramp dropped. The infected air came in, cold and copper and the faint sweetness of warp-adjacent atmosphere, and she walked down it and across the wrong mud of the LZ and into the ruined boulevard without looking back. Her white and gold carapace caught the infected yellow-green of the sky and held it briefly, and then she was 40 meters away, and then she was a silhouette, and then the ramp rose and the seals engaged, and the plasma drives moved from warming cycle to ignition, and the Enduring Complaint shuddered upward with the sustained complaint of its name. Through the viewport, a small one, scratched and milky on the port side of the cargo bay, I watched the ground fall away. The ruined boulevard, the LZ, the Vox relay tower, a figure at the tower's base, stationary, interface achieved, holding. I pressed my hand against the viewport glass for a moment. The glass was cold. Through it the figure diminished as the lighter climbed, and the infected cloud swallowed the ground. And then there was only cloud, yellow-green and wrong. And then we were above it, and the sky was black and the stars were there, indifferent and precise and old. I sat down on the cargo bay bench. I opened my logbook. I wrote, Specialist Sirene Holt, Tempestus Scion, 15 years of service. She maintained her armor through 14 days of warp siege conditions because she believed in the future version of herself that would require it. She looked through a door I did not see, opened, and found something on the other side worth staying near. She said, all right. She held the relay. I do not know what to call what I am feeling. I know it is not nothing. I know that matters. Write it down, she said. It is written. Traveler of the void. The lighter climbs. The ground falls away. Below us, in the infected yellow-green dark, a figure stands at a relay tower and holds a connection open so that we can be heard. Chapter 5 is the last transmission. The orbit. The cogitator. The thing Maren writes when she finally has time to write the thing she has been building toward since briefing Chamber 9. Secure the Geller field. Mark this chronicle. Join the crew. One chapter remains. Stand by, traveler. We are almost home. Almost. Chapter 5. The Emperor does not protect everyone. The black above Volundris 4 is a specific black. I know this because I have been above other worlds. 4 of them in 4 years of battlefield documentation service. And the black above each one is different in ways that are not meteorological or astronomical, but are the accumulated product of everything that has happened on the surface beneath. Worlds carry their history upward. The black above Craith Secundus smelled of promethium and industrial output, even at low orbit, the legacy of 200 years of hive manufacture. The black above Thessian Minor was thin and cold and very clean, the black of a world that had run out of people to dirty it. The black above Volundris 4 was the black of a world in the middle of consuming itself, thick with the particulate of 3 months of artillery exchange, and burning hab sectors and the specific atmospheric signature of sustained warp-adjacent activity, which Solmund had described as psychoactive compounds at low concentration, which I had been breathing at low concentration for the past 8 hours. I thought about this as the lighter climbed. I thought, I have been breathing the same air as the Sisters of the Fractured Chalice. For 8 hours, at lower concentration, at lesser duration, I breathed what they breathed for 14 days, and I did not feel what they felt. The hollowing of faith's felt benefit, the warp working's elegant and terrible surgery on the space between belief and the experience of belief. I felt other things. I felt afraid, and then purposeful, and then something in the sanctuary that I have not yet found the right word for, and then the specific grief of watching a ramp rise between yourself and a person you are leaving behind for reasons that are sound and that you will never entirely forgive yourself for. But I did not feel the hollowing. I have thought about why. I have had 6 months in Facility Black 9 to think about why, and the conclusion I have reached, which is not a theological conclusion. I am not qualified to reach theological conclusions. I am an archivist, and my qualifications extend to the accurate recording of what I observe. The conclusion is this: I did not feel the hollowing because I had nothing to hollow. I am not a woman of deep faith. I am a woman of deep record. My relationship with the Emperor is the relationship of a person who writes his name at the top of documents as a formal convention, and who has, in 4 years of documenting the aftermath of his Imperium's functioning, developed a complicated and unresolved relationship with the gap between what the Imperium promises and what the Imperium delivers. The warp working could not remove the felt benefit of my faith, because my faith had never produced a felt benefit to remove. It had always been precisely what it was: a practice, a convention, a formal relationship I maintained, because I lived inside a system that required it, and because the alternative, active disbelief in a universe where the warp is real, and the chaos gods are real, and faith is genuinely one of the mechanisms by which human beings resist them, is not a sustainable position for a person who intends to continue functioning. The Sisters of the Fractured Chalice had something real, and it was taken from them. I had something formal, and the warp working could not locate it to remove it. I do not know if this makes me more fortunate than them or less. I have been thinking about this for 6 months. I have not reached a conclusion. I have recorded the question instead. which is what I do with things I cannot resolve. I make them permanent, and I leave them for someone else to find, and I trust that the finding matters even when I cannot determine what the finding is for. The lighter shook, not turbulence. We were above the cloud layer, in the upper atmosphere, the plasma drives running clean in thinner air. A different kind of shaking. The shaking of a signal being received and acknowledged, which produces in the hull of a small craft a faint sympathetic vibration as the Vox array cycles through confirmation handshake with the receiving station. The relay had connected. Somewhere below us, in the infected yellow-green dark of the ruined southern spire, Sirene Hall was standing at the base of the Vox relay tower with Solman's maintenance kit and the interface sequence memorized in 4 repetitions, and her visor down and her armor perfect. And she was holding the connection open, and the connection was holding, and the Sovereign of Ruin in high orbit was receiving us. Solman confirmed. Extraction authorization transmitted and acknowledged. Docking approach vector confirmed. We are cleared. The plasma drives shifted pitch. Higher, cleaner. The sound of a machine that has been given permission to do the thing it was built for. The lighter accelerated into the upper atmosphere with the enthusiasm of something that has been patient long enough. I watched the port viewport. The cloud layer below us receded. The surface of Volundris 4 became an abstraction, a curved geography of burning orange and grey, the hive sectors visible as dense geometric clusters, the southern spire a darker smear at the edge of the visible arc. At this altitude, at this angle, in this light, the world looked quiet. The way all worlds look quiet from a sufficient distance. The way everything looks manageable from far enough away, which is why the Administratum prefers its records in summary form. Because summary form is the sufficient distance at which things look manageable. And management is the Administratum's function, and the Administratum performs its function best when it does not have to look directly at the specific individual bowl of congealed gruel that somebody prepared for a meal they never sat down to eat. I looked at the world until the cloud obscured the southern spire, and then I looked at my logbook, and then I looked at Orun. He was sitting on the bench opposite me. His hellgun was between his knees, barrel down, the correct storage position for a weapon on a craft in transit. His hands were folded on the grip. He was looking at his hands. "Orun," I said. He looked up. "I recorded what you said, about the sisters, about what they did being right." He nodded. "Then, do you think anyone will read it?" I thought about the colonel in the mask, about the Administratum seal that would go on my logbook after the Inquisitor's agents collected it, about Facility Black 9, which I did not yet know by name, but which I was, with the instinct of a woman who has spent 4 years documenting what the Imperium does with things it cannot categorize, already anticipating in general shape and function. "Someone will read it," I said. This was true. The Inquisition reads everything. The Inquisition reads everything and seals everything and files everything in the dark, and the filing is its own form of record, its own form of acknowledgement that the thing existed, and the acknowledgement matters even when the acknowledgement is secret, even when the acknowledgement produces no change, even when the thing acknowledged is subsequently bombarded from orbit and removed from all official cartographica, and the people inside it are listed in no personnel file as having been present, because they were never officially there. They were there. I was there. It is written. Someone will read it, I said again. And I believed this. And belief, I have learned, does not require felt benefit to be real. It requires only that you choose it and act as though it is true and continue. Solman worked on the cogitator for the remainder of the transit. The decryption process produced, at intervals, short confirmatory tones from the retrieval unit. Each tone the signal of another layer of encryption peeled back. Another month's worth of battle intelligence becoming readable. The Canoness's 3 months of meticulous documentation of a war that the Administratum was going to erase, emerging into legibility, one encrypted layer at a time. I read the fragments as they decrypted, because Solomon permitted this, and because the Canoness had told me to write it down, all of it, and the battle cogitator was part of all of it. The cult structure, the warp working mechanism, the ritual sites in the collapsed tertiary spire, the leadership identification, 3 names, 2 of which the Inquisition would act on within the week following our extraction, the 3rd of which had already died, killed on day 9 by the Canoness herself during a cult incursion into the outer ward that she had repelled alone while her sisters maintained the devotional office. She had repelled a cult incursion alone on day 9. The record of this was 3 lines in the battle cogitator, logged in the same careful high Gothic script as everything else. 3 lines. Then the devotional log resumed. I thought, 40 years of service, a Macarian cross, a cult incursion repelled alone on day 9 of a warp siege, and the thing she spent her last cogitator entry on was a throne she built from a Prometheum heater grill and stacked doctrinal texts. I thought, this is what a person looks like when they have decided that the thing they are doing is the most important thing they have ever done, more important than the things the Imperium gave them medals for. I thought, she was right. I thought she was right, and she is going to die in an orbital bombardment, and she knows this, and she made peace with it on day 4, and she built her throne anyway, and the throne lit, and the sisters sang at full speed, and somewhere in the rubble of the southern spire, 40 women in white armor are moving through the ruins with 43 hours remaining, and nowhere far enough to go, and the singing is probably still going. I believe the singing is still going. I am writing this 6 months later in Facility Black 9, and I believe the singing is still going. Not because 40 women can outrun an orbital bombardment, because some things, once they begin at full speed with the full force of the people behind them, continue in the record even after the voices stop. Because I was there, and I am writing it down, and the writing is the continuation. The record is the singing. This is what I have learned in 6 months of writing in a facility whose location I do not know, whose windows I cannot see from, whose food tastes like corpse starch heated to a temperature that is technically warm. The record is the singing. The act of documentation is the act of saying, this happened, and it mattered, and I refuse to allow the Administratum's silence to be the last word on it. The last word is mine. I am the Archivist. Krael did not speak for most of the transit. He sat at the far end of the cargo bay with his hellgun across his lap, and his prayer beads in his left hand, and his eyes on the middle distance. And the middle distance he was looking at was not the same distance Siren had been looking at. His was closer, more immediate, the middle distance of a man reviewing a decision he cannot unmake and has not decided yet how to carry. He had let them live. He had given them 43 hours of open air and the instruction to move, which he knew, and they knew, and I knew, was not survival, but was the form that mercy took in a situation where survival was not on offer. He had done this against direct operational orders from inquisitorial authority, in the field, without sanction, without documentation, except for mine, except for the logbook that was going to be collected the moment we docked and sealed into a vermilion clearance file that would spend the rest of its existence being read 17 times in private and having no official position taken on its contents. He had done it because I asked a question. I did not know, in the moment of asking, whether I was asking because I believed the answer would change anything, or because I needed the question to exist in the record regardless of what it changed. I know now. The question was for the record. The record was for whoever reads it in the dark of a sealed archive, and finds themselves in possession of the truth of what happened on Volundris 4, and chooses privately, in a facility whose windows cannot be seen from, to let that truth matter to them. I wrote, Sergeant Primus Davin Crail, Tempestus Scion, 15 years of service. He has not spoken for 2 hours and 11 minutes. His prayer beads have not stopped. I believe he is praying with more sincerity than he has in years, possibly ever. Not because his faith has increased, but because the thing he is praying about has become specific. Specific things produce specific prayers. Specific prayers are the most honest kind. He looked up from the middle distance, briefly, and saw me writing, and looked away again. He knew I was writing about him. He did not ask me to stop. The Sovereign of Ruin filled the viewport. It arrived the way command barges always arrive when you are approaching them from below. Immense first, then impossibly immense, then so immense that the category of immense ceases to function, and the mind defaults to simply processing it as the new horizon, the new ground, the new sky. It was a vessel of the Militarum's mid-tier command fleet, not the largest, not the most decorated, but large enough that 3,000 people lived inside it and called it home and navigated its recycled air and its compromised lighting and its corridors that made sense to no one who hadn't been aboard it for at least a month. Its hull was dark iron and old prayer parchment, and the accumulated barnacle growth of void-faring equipment, added and modified and never quite cleanly removed over centuries of continuous operation. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 8 hours. Not because it was beautiful, because it was ordinary. Because it smelled, even through the lighter's sealed hull, of the particular accumulated humanness of 10,000 people, living in close quarters inside a machine that had been recycling their air and their water for longer than anyone could reliably calculate. Because it was not wrong. Because its mud did not move slowly, and its lumens did not fail to penetrate, and its silence was the contingent silence of a place that could be made loud at any moment by the ordinary sounds of people going about the ordinary business of existing. The docking collar engaged, the mag seals locked, the lighter shuddered once, settled, was still. The ramp dropped. Standing at the bottom of it, in the grey corridor of the Sovereign of Ruin's secondary docking bay, were 2 people I had not seen before. They were not Militarum. They were not Mechanicus. They wore the kind of clothing that is designed to resemble no institutional affiliation, while being clearly the clothing of people with institutional affiliation so total that they have moved past the need to display it. The woman had a data slate. The man had nothing visible, and was therefore carrying something I could not see. The woman said, Archivist Secundus Voss. Yes. The cogitator, please. Crail descended the ramp. He looked at the 2 people. He handed the cogitator to the woman without speaking. She accepted it without speaking. The man moved briefly to Crail's right, and something passed between them that I could not document because I was not close enough, and because some transactions are conducted in the language of people who understand each other's institutional position well enough to communicate in the shorthand of people who know what is owed and what will not be discussed. Then the woman looked at me. Your logbook, please. I looked at the logbook in my hands. 4 years old. Ink-stained. Parchment rated for moderate acidic precipitation. My handwriting on moving stairs. Illegible to everyone except me. The record of 8 hours in a building that would not appear on any cartographica. The Canoness's words. Orun's words. The covered icons and the face-down manuscripts, and the bowl I had straightened, and the warmth of the iron doors, and Sirene saying all right, and the singing at full speed, and the way the throne lit, and the amber warmth of it on my face in the darkness of the Sanctuary Majoris. All of it. I gave it to her. She took it, looked at it briefly. At the cover, not the contents. the contents she would read later in a room I would not be in, and placed it under her arm. "You'll come with us," she said, not unkindly, in the tone of a person delivering information rather than issuing an order, which is the most polite form that compulsion takes in the Imperium. "There are some things we need to discuss." I looked at Crail. He looked at me. His prayer beads were in his pocket. He said, "She wrote everything down." "Yes," the woman said. "We know. I have been in Facility Black 9 for 6 months. I do not know its location. I know it is cold and the windows cannot be seen from my room, which suggests either that there are no windows or that the room is positioned such that the windows are not accessible to me. And I have decided not to determine which, because the determination would not change anything material about my situation and would cost me the small comfort of not knowing. I am given paper. I am given ink and a stylus that functions correctly, which is an improvement on the one I had in the field. I am given food that tastes like corpse starch heated to technically warm. I am given each morning the same question from the same inquisitorial representative. "Is there anything you have remembered that you have not yet written down?" Each morning I say, "Yes," and I write it. And the next morning there is more, because memory is not a fixed quantity. It is a practice, and practice generates more of the thing being practiced, and 6 months of daily writing about 8 hours in the reliquary of the blind eye has produced not a diminishing record, but an expanding one, as though the act of documentation is itself a kind of excavation, and the excavation goes deeper the longer you dig. I believe this is why they keep me here, not to contain me, to use me. They want the complete record, and the complete record is not a thing I can hand over in a logbook. It is a thing that is still being produced 6 months later in the facility whose windows I cannot see from, and it will be produced for as long as I am capable of producing it. And when I am no longer capable, the record will be sealed and filed and read 17 times in private and have no official position taken on its contents. This is my function. I have found, to my genuine surprise, that I do not resent it. 43 hours after we left the reliquary, the orbital bombardment of the site designated Volundris 4, Southern Spire, Reliquary of the Blind Eye, was conducted per inquisitorial authorization. I know this because it is in the facility's standard briefing materials, a one-line notation in the operational summary of Operation Hollow Crown, between the notation of the cult leadership captures and the notation of the ongoing militarum pacification effort in the northern hive sectors. One line, site sterilization conducted per schedule. No complications reported, no complications. I have written, in the 6 months since, approximately 40,000 words about the complications. This document is the summary. The full record is longer, and it is sealed, and it is being read in the dark by people who have no official position on its contents, and that is fine. That is the nature of the record I have always kept. Not public, not celebrated, not designed to change anything in the immediate operational sense. Designed to exist, to be the permanent fact of what happened, against the Administratum's silence, against the orbital bombardment's thoroughness, against the very efficient erasure that the Imperium performs on things it cannot categorize. The reliquary of the blind eye is rubble. The Order of the Fractured Chalice is listed in no current Adepta Sororitas registry. Volundris IV does not appear on the current Administratum Cartographica. Operation Hollow Crown produced no official after-action report. Archivist Secundus Maren Voss is listed in the Munitorum's personnel records as reassigned. Details classified. None of this changes what happened. The Canoness built a throne from the materials available to her, in the time available to her, with the people available to her, and the throne lit. 40 women sang at full speed after 14 days of half speed, and the singing was the most honest sound I have ever heard in my service. which has not been short on sounds. Sirene Holt stood at a relay tower in the open air and held a connection open so that the rest of us could be heard. And she did this with the composure of a woman who had already found the thing worth staying near, and who was therefore not afraid of the 40 minutes or what came after them. Orun Tal refused to let what he saw in the sanctuary be reduced to a footnote in his own memory, and asked me to write it down. And I did. And the writing of it was the fulfillment of the asking. And both of those things were acts of faith in the continuation of the record. Sergeant Primus Davin Crail let 40 women walk out of a building with 43 hours remaining because someone asked him whether they had done anything worth dying for. And the answer was no. And he knew the answer, and he acted on it. And whatever the inquisitorial representative said to him at the bottom of the ramp in the secondary docking bay was sufficient to close the matter institutionally. Which tells me something about the Inquisition that I have filed under things the Inquisition will not confirm, but has not denied. And Sister Hospitaller Iseult Dara sat in the corner of the Medici bay and asked me to write down the results of the experiment she and her sisters had run for 14 days, and I wrote them down. And the results are, there is no ratio of prayer to silence that produces intervention. The variable was not the quality of the faith. The silence was constant. The relationship between them did not change. And also, a throne lit in the dark of a sanctuary majoris, in the southern spire of a hive world that no longer appears on any cartographica, and 40 women sang at full speed, and the feeling came back. And Iseult Dara is the one who taught me, without intending to, in a Medici bay, with her knees to her chest, that these two results are not contradictions. They are the complete answer. The experiment had 2 parts, and she reported only the first, because the second had not yet happened when I found her. The second part of the result is this: the silence did not change, and they built something in the silence anyway, and it worked. Not because the Emperor came, not because intervention occurred, because 40 people with 260 years of collective devotion decided that the silence was not the end of the conversation and kept talking, and the talking generated sufficient reality that the thing they were talking toward had somewhere to arrive. Whether it arrived, whether the warmth in the sanctuary majoris was the Emperor's presence, or the concentrated psychic mass of 40 faithful people, generating their own answer to their own prayers, I cannot determine. I am an archivist. I document what is there. What was there was warmth and light, and full-speed singing, and a throne that was not empty, and a woman named Sirene, who saw something I did not see, and carried it to the end, with the composure of someone who had already decided it was worth carrying. What was there was real. The Emperor does not protect everyone. I have said this before. I will say it once more, because this is the final entry, and the final entry should contain the thing the record was built toward, the conclusion that all the documentation was in service of. The thing Canoness Vesper Auric understood on day 14 in the Reliquary of the Blind Eye when she decided that understanding it was not the end but the beginning. The Emperor does not protect everyone. He is doing the impossible thing, holding the Astronomicon, manning the boundary between the warp and reality, burning himself to keep the Geller fields of 10,000 ships running through the darkness of the void. And he is doing it endlessly, at a cost no living person can calculate. And his attention is finite in ways the Catechism does not acknowledge, because the Catechism was written to strengthen faith, and not to describe the Emperor accurately. And those are different projects with different requirements, and they have been confused with each other for 10,000 years. This is not abandonment. This is not absence. This is the reality of a being performing an act of infinite cost in a universe of finite resources, and the Reliquary of the Blind Eye is one of 10,000 fires. he could not attend to simultaneously, and the Sisters of the Fractured Chalice are 40 of the 10 trillion people. He sustains collectively and cannot accompany individually, and the silence they experienced for 14 days was not the silence of a God who had stopped caring. It was the silence of a God who was otherwise occupied. And the answer to that silence, the Canoness's answer, the answer she built from a Prometheum grill and stacked devotional texts and 40 women's worth of combined faith, was not to stop, was not to wait, was not to diminish the prayer until it matched the silence, was to build something, to fill the silence with the most faithful thing available, which was not a miracle and not an intervention, but the sustained, deliberate, mortal act of people who understood that they were not going to be rescued and decided to keep going anyway. That is the faith the Catechism does not describe, the faith that does not require felt benefit, the faith that operates in the dark, in the silence, in the 48 hours before the orbital bombardment, in the 6 months of a facility whose windows cannot be seen from. The faith that says, the record matters even if it is sealed. The prayer matters even if it is not answered. The singing matters even if the building is rubble. Someone has to do the work when the Emperor cannot attend. Someone has to stand at the relay tower and hold the connection open. Someone has to straighten the bowl. Someone has to write it down. The Emperor does not protect everyone. Someone has to. Archivist Maren Voss. Volundris 4, Day 32 of the Uprising. Facility Black 9, Month 6 of reassignment, signing off. Traveller of the Void, you have reached the end of the transmission. The record of Volundris IV is complete. The reliquary of the Blind Eye is rubble. The Order of the Fractured Chalice appears in no official registry. The singing is static. You heard it. That means something. Maren Voss believed that. The Canoness believed that. Seren Hall stood at a relay tower in the open air and held the connection open so that you could hear it, so that the record could reach you, so that you, specifically you, traveler, reading this in the dark of wherever you are, could know what happened in a building that no longer exists, to people who are listed in no file, on a world that appears on no cartographica. They were there. You know they were there. That is the function of the record. If this chronicle found purchase in you, if something in this transmission mattered, then do what Maren did. Make a record. Mark this chronicle with your approval. Let the Emperor witness that you were here. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors. Subscribe, sound the bell of notification, and pass this transmission to another traveler in the dark. The Emperor does not protect everyone, but the crew looks after its own. This has been Voidborn Terrors. The static continues. We leave it running. Signing off, traveler, until the next transmission finds you.